Fated Luck, Book 6 of the Twisted Luck series. Written by Mel Todd. Narrated by Autumn Juliet. Thoughts. To all those who have believed in me, thank you. I promise there are more stories to come. Chapter 1. While some familiars exhibit above-animal intelligence, and the monsters that live in the realms occasionally talk to people, for the most part what evidence we have is they are barbaric, possibly nomadic, with minimal social structure and no formal higher education. It is possible there is an apprenticeship structure in place, but that is only a theory. History of magic. Tiang, I don't care what Shishi wants. I can't and won't move to China. The exasperation in my voice must have finally registered because Tiang sagged. Even his whisker tendrils and yellow neck ruffles drooped. The dragon of China rarely looked depressed, but right now he looked wilted.
But you'd be treated like royalty, and I'd have someone to talk to.
He whined. I glared at him. 150-year-old being should not be whining. You can talk to and visit Caroline whenever you want. You know how to find and visit your family, which means you're being ridiculous. I crossed my arms, not taking my eyes off him. He had to quit doing this. She is correct. It is most unbecoming of a dragon to beg, especially to a human. Zmog's voice rang in my head. Thanks, Zmog. I managed to keep my voice level, and I didn't glare at the dragon. Much. Her help always left me feeling even smaller than I usually did around the dragons. We were standing in one of the many dragon pocket realms. This area they had altered to make it tolerable for humans, what with our weak skin and puny lungs. A direct quote from Zmog. It was a mountainous area, with peaks that reached above the clouds, the air crisp and cold, and part of me wanted to go for a hike. There was the sense of adventure waiting just out of sight. The rest of me wanted to go home. I had work in the morning, and being here meant I wasn't helping Joe and Sable with dinner.
She values your input. She has figured out the medal to give you and everything. The ceremony will be extravagant.
The obvious sop to my ego didn't help, and I glared at Tiang. I've told her I don't need a medal, and she has advisors and family and other mages. Well, I know less than nothing about Chinese politics. The unrest is settled. She needs to make friends and contacts in China. It had taken a full year for the obvious infighting to settle down, and for the government to accept Shishi as the empress. There were still some social issues going on, but as far as the rest of the world knew, China accepted their new ruler. I, on the other hand, got hit with Tiang whining, Caroline bouncing over to hang with him, and a lonely woman who I couldn't even talk to without my familiar. My Mandarin was less than non-existent.
I know,
Tiang sighed.
but she expects traitors everywhere. It makes it hard for her to trust even when I tell her the person is trustworthy. She needs to show how much you saved us.
I saved my people too. She will learn. I didn't mean to be unkind, but really, calling me every time his mage had issues was ridiculous. Besides, Shishi was a decade older than me. Then there was the metal business. China, well, more accurately, Shishi, and the U.S. State Department had been fighting for ages to agree. It took months to get the medal they wanted to give me approved through Congress. Then Shishi got in on the medal idea, and she wanted a big joint awards ceremony in Beijing. I just hoped that if they kept arguing about who was going to host the ceremony, eventually it would all go away.
I guess.
If anything, Tiang looked even more dispirited, and I had to resist giving in to his desires. Caroline had been exploring the area, ignoring us, which told me I was as safe as I could be. Granted, with dragons, that didn't mean much. They were very capable of killing me by patting me on the back. "Go home, Tiang. Teacher chosen to be as strong as Caroline." Smog shooed her son with her wing. He moped, but left a minute later. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile, then looked at Smog. "I take it you wanted to talk to me?" I said, looking at the dragon. Smog didn't do subtle, or at least the human version of subtle. "I do enjoy humans who know how to think. There is a request for you to visit the Council of Lords later this turning. I want you to come." "The Council of what?" I blinked at her, feeling off balance. That wasn't anything I had expected. I'd never had anything to do with the realms or the lords, besides the weird friendship we had, if you could call it that. Why would anyone want me at anything involving the lords? That is Esmir and Tersing stuff. It makes no sense for me to go. Do you? Smog shifted a bit. "Onyx usually goes. I find them boring, but the lords want to talk to you. Something about needing human input, I think. Or was it about the magic Tersing is still getting from your people?" She wiggled her wings. "Or maybe they just want to see her pet human." "I'm not her pet human," I growled. I still didn't know if that had been my most brilliant idea ever, or the worst in the history of the world. Caught in a situation where a disabled girl was about to be killed, I'd leveraged the favor Tersane had gifted me and asked her to drain the magic from the girl. Because of how I'd phrased it, she'd taken the magic from everyone who couldn't use it appropriately according to our laws. It had been a lot of magic, and Tersane, a lord of spirit, had been drunk on magic for months afterwards. Salastra, her equal for order, still wasn't speaking to me, and it had been almost 2 years. That part I didn't mind so much. But I still didn't know what the tattoo Esmir gifted me with meant, and I still owed Salastra 3 favors for making an assumption. Thinking about the complexity of these relationships had me rubbing my left forearm, where a snake, a unicorn horn with 3 of the 4 sections of the horn empty, waiting for me to fulfill a favor, and a cat nose with whiskers, tattoos gleamed back at me. Brands, warnings, promises. They were all of that and more. I don't know what they want me to say. I didn't know she'd do that. I just was trying to save one girl. The fact that I had probably saved thousands meant no one was complaining. Plus, Charles had mentioned to me that they had seen an overall drop in crime rates, at least in the US. No data was available as to why, but it had sharply dropped off starting days after Tersane absorbed the magic. Was it causation or correlation? I didn't know. And I wasn't going to worry about it. That was way out of my scope of responsibility. They're concerned that she is still getting the occasional magic boost. Huh? I swear, I sounded like an idiot in half of my conversations with denizens from the other realms. But there was never any logic as to where the conversations would twist to. Hence, I was always playing catch-up. You didn't know? Smog sounded intrigued, twisting her head almost upside down looking at me. It made my back hurt thinking about my spine mimicking her movements. Nope, no clue, but I'm not sure what they think I can do. Smog straightened up her head. That is why they want you to come to the council meeting? I groaned and looked at my watch. 3 hours had passed since Tiang had begged me to come. When is it? Maybe I'd be lucky and it would be at a time I couldn't possibly attend. At your convenience. They're setting up an area now. Any time in the next Earth year would be acceptable. I groaned and nodded. Fine. Try to make it a weekend. At her tilted head, I groaned. the 6th and 7th day of our week. Check with Caroline, he knows the days. I didn't want to get any more involved in things with the realms, but it looked like I wasn't going to be given a choice. Excellent. I will let them know. She lifted her head. Now, I believe I shall hunt. Until we meet again, Harold. I groaned and ducked as she beat her wings, sending up clouds of dust into my face. I pulled on air, countering her effects as she flew away from me. You ready to go, Caroline?
This place is nice. The scents are sharp. But yes, the egos around here are exhausting.
Snorting in amusement, I sidestepped back to the house in Albany, only to be greeted by the discordant notes of my phone ringing. Dang it! I dove for my phone. We didn't want my easy sidestepping to be obvious, so my phone number was a voice-over internet number that Charles routed around for us. He had a server in his house and used it to host various websites, but he also set up encrypted VPNs that all of our calls went through. And since it rang via the net, you'd have to know what cell tower to look at to find my data usage. I also made sure my phone was in airplane mode every time I sidestepped, but if I was going into the realms, I just left it behind. The screen listed 2 missed calls as I answered. Munroe, I said, not sure who was calling me. About time. We need you in New Mexico 2 hours ago. A plane is waiting for you at the DeKalb Peachtree Airport. Can you be there in 30? Naomi Towers, my boss, snapped out. I didn't apologize or protest. If they were calling me, it was bad. What I had to figure out was if I could realistically get to the airport that fast. The draft had placed me with a special activities group. Some days I was in the lab trying to figure out where a bacteria came from. The next, I was helping hunt down an escaped criminal. I might be doing search and rescue, or I might be combing through realms of data to figure out how someone was laundering money. We caught all the cases that they didn't know where to dump, or that were too weird to make sense. It wasn't medicine, but I enjoyed it, especially as it gave me access to all the libraries. I never knew when a bit of research might give me a clue about Stevie, and that kept me from stressing over when Christos would turn 18. Joe Guzman, Sable Lancet, and I had moved into the Albany house a few months after Joe finished her draft. They were my partners and my best friends, but the draft board had placed my central location in Atlanta. We kept a small studio apartment in Atlanta that I crashed at occasionally, and it gave me a safe place for sidestepping. Joe and Sable used it when they wanted to spend some time closer to Joe's family. We missed being able to see the Guzmans easily, but Caroline helped with that, acting as a shuttle service when needed. Joe and Sable had found local jobs here, and we loved the house and Hamadia the Dryad that was part of the house. We were happier here than Atlanta, which meant juggling my need to commute, sometimes at the last second. Hamadia's excitement after we moved in had kept the house filled with a sense of effervescence. Somehow, James and Georgas had grafted her tree as part of the house. This had the effect of making the house Hamadia's physical body and made it alive. She acted like our protector and was almost a friend, though in some ways she was more inhuman than Esmir or Tursane. Can you have a car pick me up at the apartment? I still didn't enjoy driving, didn't own a car, and I usually took public transportation, or rode a bike. But if time was of the essence, then that wasn't really feasible. Yes, it'll be there in 5. She snapped out, and then hung up. Come on, Caroline. I changed clothes, twisted my braids into a thick tail down my back, then grabbed my go bag and Caroline's kit. I'll get your harness on you in the plane. He was by my side as I raced down to where Joe and Sable probably were. Sure enough, they were curled up in the sitting room, though Joe swore it should be called the living room. Joe was reading the gossip tabloid Daily Magical News, mostly for the ridiculous things they put in there. Hi, Cori, you're back, Sable blurted, sitting up straighter. We wanted to talk to you for a bit. Sorry, no time. Stopped by to tell you I'm running to work. They have an emergency and are picking me up outside the Atlanta airport in, 2 minutes. I've got my phone and you can ping Caroline. Love you both. Bye. Sidestepping, I turned before they could say anything. I landed, then darted out the door of the apartment, running down the stairs. Caroline loped beside me.
Do you know where we are going?
Not yet. I figure we'll find out in the car or on the plane.
Planes are uncomfortable and just wrong. I may meet you there.
We had let my boss know that he could step through the planes to find me, but never mentioned people could come with him or that he could take me to a place he had found. Most people still forgot he was a person in his own right, treating his ability to come to me as a cute trick rather than thinking about what it actually meant. I was more than willing to let people underestimate him. It made life easier. Those few who suspected what he could do didn't say much to me. Even though I sidestepped probably more than I should, most people didn't question me or even wonder. Everyone knew I lived in Atlanta, and that was the end of it. As long as I didn't force them to figure out a conflict, they accepted what they thought of as true. The draft seemed happy with me in this job and mostly ignored me. Maybe I'd been lucky and they had more important problems to focus on. I made it to the sidewalk, tugging on my official hoodie, dark blue with the word agent on it and our logo in the corner. My ID badge was in the pocket of my cargo pants, and everything else was in my bag. Caroline's harness, water bowls, food, and booties were in his kit bag. If they were flying me out somewhere, it was a place that needed my on-the-ground abilities, not my research skills, so I dressed accordingly. A car, the ubiquitous black which always amused me, pulled up and a man rolled down the passenger window and looked at me.
Agent Munroe and Kellen?
He asked, eyes lingering on Caroline, who nodded. Caroline, but yes. I already had the door open as we spoke, and Caroline leapt in first.
Okay, buckle up. This is going to be a fast ride.
He nodded once at both of us, flipping on the lights and siren before taking off. Caroline sank his claws into the seats as I gripped the handles. The driver wasn't kidding when he said fast ride. I gave up and closed my eyes. Otherwise, I'd have a heart attack before we got to the airport.
This is why I prefer transporting myself,
Caroline snarled in my mind. I silently agreed with him, but didn't say anything, though a sigh of relief slipped out of my lips as we jerked to a stop at the tarmac. They must have had the gates open waiting for us. My life was rarely this exciting.
They're waiting for you,
the driver said as I gathered my stuff. They?
The boss.
That would be interesting. I didn't think Naomi had tagged along for quite a while. You staying or traveling alone? I said in a low voice as I trudged to the stairs into the plane. Caroline lifted his head and examined it, ears laid back.
I will meet you there. Maybe there will be a hunt. I need to practice my skills.
I snickered and rolled my eyes, climbing the stairs to the plane to find out what the mission was. Chapter 2. Cori Munroe made the news again today with the violent apprehension of a suspect. The man wanted for questioning in a child trafficking ring was delivered maimed and screaming. She had no comment when asked. The monster at her side had been observed licking blood off its claws. Later, she was seen petting and praising it. Should the stance on familiars be revisited? Are they safe to be roaming around? Do we want to be rewarding attacks on humans? Daily Magical News. The airplane delivered me to Atlanta late 2 days later, and the same driver brought me back to the apartment. I was too tired even to talk to him. I trudged up the stairs in the muggy fall heat that was somehow worse than the dry heat of the Arizona desert. I slipped into the apartment and the air conditioning slapped me like an ice-cold, fuzzy lint rag. I shivered, the temperature difference too great to make it comfortable. Ugh, this is when I envy you, the fact that you don't have to wear clothes. I muttered. Caroline sprawled out on the cool floor of the tiny kitchen, content. I sighed and started to strip. I was exhausted, but needed a shower. Half naked, I repacked the bag, making a note of what I needed to restock. The assignment had been interesting, but they'd grabbed me more for Caroline than my skills. While most didn't regard him as human intelligent, they had no doubt he could understand them. The tracking of a fugitive pedophile across the open desert had been exhilarating, if exhausting for me.
I enjoyed that,
he said while licking his claws, his muzzle pulled back, making a face.
But the stuff they clean off blood with is disgusting. Blood has a good flavor. You destroy it with that awful stuff.
Huh, I'll ask them to skip the acetone. But most people don't like the idea of animals licking up human blood. It worries them. I sent a text to Naomi asking that next time Caroline be cleaned off with water, not chemicals. I doubted she'd argue with me too much. He still cowed people when he yawned.
I'm not an animal. I am a cath, and humans put too much crap into their bodies to ever be first choice. But the spice of fear is delicious.
He was laughing at me. I picked up my sweaty undershirt and threw it at him.
Scent of a strong queen. My favorite.
He stopped his grooming to roll in my shirt. You are such a cat. I headed to the shower and tried to wash off as much grime as possible. Joe and Sable knew what I did, but they both got oddly upset when it looked like I'd been doing dangerous activities. More so in the last few months than before. It was easier to shower and go home looking sedate rather than dangerous. Caroline always looked himself, though. Before we sidestepped back, I always double-checked to make sure there wasn't any blood on him. Blood got everyone upset, and Hamadia hated it. The mail hadn't been checked for a while, but I shrugged. All the bills were paid, and it was almost always junk mail. It would wait. With a sigh of relief, I stepped home and felt Hamadia's warmth wrap around me. My house, or our roommate, depending on how you wanted to look at it, made sure the house was the right temperature and always smelled delicious. But that could also be Joe's cooking. "I'm home," I called as I stepped away from the sidestep area. We'd cordoned off a small corner that we never put anything into, just so I had a safe sidestepping place. Hamadia had decorated the walls in that corner with a mural of her glade, the flowers and trees creating a unique area. All in all, my life was pretty good, and it finally felt like all my dreams were coming true. It was dinner time, and walking in, I moaned at the smell of Joe's cooking, my mouth already watering. Joe and Sable sat at the kitchen counter arguing over something, the remnants of dinner pushed away. "Ooh, anything left?" Sorry, it was a busy day. They both looked tired, but Joe nodded. "Yep, plate is in the oven for you."
And me.
Caroline managed to whine and look hopeful at the same time. Joe grinned, and some of the stress left her shoulders. "Yes, and I have some for you too." She stood and grabbed a bowl with meat and some grains in it. He didn't eat much grains, but occasionally liked it for the texture. "Heart fresh from the butcher. He ground it especially for you."
Excellent. Heart and liver are the best parts of any animal.
I shuddered while Joe just looked amused, setting it down for him. Caroline tended to eat big meals like that twice a week, otherwise just nibbling on our food along with the kibble we stored in a jar if he wanted it. He told me once the kibble was like fiber was for us. Good, but not something you really looked forward to. As if he could read my thoughts, he went up on his hind legs and grabbed the kibble off the counter, opened the jar, and sprinkled some on the heart.
It adds a bit of crunch, and the chase wore me out.
Chase? Joe and Sable snapped their attention to me at that. I pulled my dinner out, and we all transferred to the dining room. The bar worked great to talk to someone cooking, or if there were just two of us in the kitchen. But with the three of us, being able to see faces made talking easier. Yeah, you knew they flew me to Arizona. I'd sent them the bare details, but not much more than I'm here and alive. But they needed details. I needed to track a fugitive from an illegal border crossing. Turns out he was a pedophile. We had to race across the desert. Their dogs couldn't keep up with the motorcycle he had, and he knew the canyons out there well enough to stay out of the way of the helicopters. So Caroline got to play hide and seek. I was downplaying it a lot, not mentioning the cave system and him taking pot shots at anyone who came into his line of sight. I also didn't mention the crazy request from some unidentified officers to let him escape. That bit of information was never mentioned to Caroline. Naomi could deal with the interagency's bullcrap. I'd had fun tromping through the desert and caves. Sometimes magic wasn't as good as a keen nose and the ability to make intelligent decisions.
It was fun, and this is suitable recompense as I did not get to eat him.
Caroline had blood on his muzzle, and I mock-gagged at the sight. One of these days, I'm gonna let you eat someone and then laugh when they taste horrible. And you get indigestion, Sable teased.
Who says I haven't already?
He delicately picked up a kibble and popped it in his mouth. I hear nothing. I don't want to know, I said, turning to my food, pot roast and some bread. So, what is going on with you two? You both look like you're discussing something heavy, but I know, or at least think, work is going fine, and you would have told me if there were any medical issues. I took a bite, watching as they glanced at each other. They looked at each other again. Then Sable reached out to hold Joe's hand. You know we want to have kids, right? Joe asked, an oddly beseeching look on her face. Sure, you've always wanted that. I've joked that I'll be the aunt that spoils them and hands them back. I kept eating, confused by this conversation. Joe cleared her throat. You remember the sex game? I'm pretty sure I'll never forget it, I said dryly. It was the first time I met Tersane. Watching almost 20,000 people die tends to stick in your memory. Yeah, well, even with Caroline, a normal offering wasn't enough. At this point I paused, my throat tightening. I would have offered my life to save everyone, especially Sanchez and Sable. Her hand clutched harder on Sable's. But normal offerings weren't enough. To break the bonds, I had to offer all my eggs and the lining in my uterus. Even if I had an embryo placed inside me, I couldn't carry it. The grief on her face made me want to spring across the table and pull her into a hug, but the stiffness in her body held me in place. Joe, I'm so sorry. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, setting my fork down, suddenly not very hungry. She shrugged, mustering up a fake smile. What good would it have done? It was over and it couldn't be changed, and I don't regret the offering. And while I was a bit sad, I figured my partner could have the kid, and we'd work something out. I didn't know if Sable was the one or not. Joe laughed. It was our first date, remember? I nodded slowly, but the lump didn't go away. Sable started this time, her smile a pale version of her normal joy. We were still taking it slow, even if we hadn't moved in together. Then Esmir fixed my pancreas. We didn't think anything about it until the last month or so, when we started talking seriously about children. We figured I'd get artificially inseminated and no problem. This time, Sable took a deep breath. I wanted to throw up. Something bad was coming. I just knew it. We thought we'd run the idea by Esmir, just in case. And she let us know that because of how magic changed my pancreas to work, insulin won't work on me. And the odds are the weight gain from being pregnant would slip me into brittle diabetes, and insulin wouldn't be able to counter it. Very likely, it would kill me and any child I was carrying. Oh, Merlin, I murmured, my heart breaking for the two of them. I am so sorry. I don't know what to say. I could see their dreams breaking in their eyes. We've been looking at options, but we don't have many, Jo said, her voice hesitant. We're well paid, but paying someone is really expensive. Plus, it just feels wrong, Sable added. Since there's no way we can carry a child, we're hoping, maybe. Jo trailed off, and I glared at her. Jo, spit it out. What are you talking about? A pool of nerves swarmed my stomach. Jo rarely got nervous talking to me. I never seen her hem and haw so much over anything. Can I ask? I know. I want to ask. Hamadia appeared in the entrance to the kitchen, bubbling up and down, her toes hitting the floor with ballet-like taps.
Anything to stop this. You both are acting like timid baby goats,
Caerleon said, his attention on finishing the last drops of his food in the bowl. Don't you dare, Hamadia, Sable gasped, glaring at her. We need to ask. It has to be right.
Humans, you fret so much over spawning. Just let her seeds go like I do. Yours will grow and be strong.
Hamadia danced, spinning around with flowers sprouting. I was distracted as bits of leaves and flowers scattered around the room. Hamadia, are you coming all over the floors? I asked, looking at what could only be pollen dusted over a chair.
I am not coming anywhere. I am here.
She looked at me confused, while Sable and Jo were turning red, trying not to laugh. Hamadia was very sensitive to being laughed at, and didn't always understand the difference between laughing at and with. I managed to find the right words. Is that pollen you just dusted over the kitchen? She peered down at it, then nodded.
Yes, but it isn't fertile. Dryads don't spawn like that. The house has seeds, and I shoot them down the gutters so they can find some place to grow. But I don't think any of them have yet,
she said, an odd sadness in her.
Earth isn't very habitable to my kind.
Sable looked up from where she'd had her head on her arms, trying to get control of herself. Hamadia, do you want to have a child? Hamadia tilted her head like an owl, eliciting a shudder from the three of us.
I had not thought about it, but here it is too dangerous.
The fact that she questioned it made me curious. Why would it be dangerous? We could plant it in the back with the other trees, and it would be safe here.
Yes, but when you die, others come in. It takes decades for a child of mine to fruit.
I wasn't 100% sure what that meant. Maybe, but there are things we can do.
I will think. It is something I did not think I could do.
She floated, her head still looking at us like a twisted owl.
But that is a theme here. Are you going to ask her? Otherwise I will. I wish for this. Children make laughter. Laughter makes magic.
There were too many meanings in those sentences for me to parse out. I grabbed the lowest branch. Laughter doesn't give fairies wings, does it? The phrase from a children's story where a bunch of children lived in the spirit realm, having adventures, flicked through my head.
There are no fairies. How would they get wings, anyhow? No, laughter is just beauty and sound, especially from children. Now say yes,
she demanded. To what? At this point, I'd given up eating. No idea what was going on with anything.
To their request,
Hamadia exclaimed, stomping one foot and flinging an arm at Jo and Sable, who had paled and looked like they were trying to form words. They haven't asked me, I started, but Joe blurted in. Hey, Maria, stop. Let us ask, okay? You can listen if you want. It came out in a rush and sounded like bribery to me, but who was I to judge?
Ooh, yes.
I swear, she sounded like she was about to get the best gossip in the world. With a sigh, I turned to Joe and Sable. So? Ask me what? This is getting silly. Joe looked like she might pass out, so I was relieved when Sable squeezed her hand. I'll ask. Joe sagged a bit, but nodded. Cori? Sable started, and I swear the whole house creaked and leaned in to listen. Will you carry our child for us? Chapter 3. Mages get pregnant all the time, just like all other women. While some report less exhaustion than their non-magical friends, there seems to be no significant difference in how the gestation proceeds. Remember to use your magic while you're pregnant. It will help keep you in touch with your abilities. The Pregnant Mage. I choked, eyes wide, looking at them. Even Caroline seemed a bit stunned. Wait, what? I stared at my best friends, my partners, and Joe had the audacity to smirk. Is magic killing your ability to hear too? I blinked, trying to process the request. Explain why you would want me to carry a child? I don't even have sex. Sex sounds completely unpleasant. Why ask me? I didn't know how to explain my confusion. We've been talking about this for days. We want children, but we don't want a stranger, and while we can adopt, we want to try this first. Joe reached her hand out to me. Will you be part of this with us? Carry our children? Be their mother in both fact and name? How was I supposed to answer that? I'd never even considered being pregnant before. It didn't sound horrible, but at the same time, it didn't sound fun. Who would the father be? I needed more information to figure out the correct answer to this. I needed all the information. Joe shrugged, an odd expression on her face. Sable, on the other hand, laughed. We talked about this a little before we realized I couldn't have children either. We kind of want to keep it in the family. I'd feel weird about a stranger. I said we should ask Sanchez. Stinky? I blurted, then laughed at myself. It might have been a bit hysterical. You want to ask your brother Sanchez to be your sperm donor? I know, it sounds ridiculous, but Sanchez is a good man, and is the only one of my brothers not seriously involved with anyone. The one girl we thought he might stay with got tired of his refusal to commit. Joe shrugged. We need to discuss it with him. And normally I don't think parents should have much say in this, but I think my parents should know. It would be their grandchild from their son and daughter after all. She smirked at both of us, sitting up straighter, her tone of voice changing to smugness. Besides, we Gesmans have good genes. Sable groaned and yanked her hand away. With comments like that, I might change my mind. Nah, you love my family. Joe countered, still grinning. Yes, I do. I guess I'll just have to put up with you. Sable leaned over and kissed Joe in the mouth, and a minute later, I cleared my throat as they were still kissing. If I want porn, I'll pay for it, thank you. My voice was sarcastic, but still, I loved their passion. I just had never felt any of it. Sorry, so? Joe asked, looking anxious. My mouth went dry as I looked at their hopeful faces. I need to think about it. I've just never really considered it before. When their faces fell, I held up my hand. I'm not saying no, but this is like finding out I'm a mage. I need to think about it first, okay? Sable nodded, even though Joe looked sad. That makes sense. In all honesty, I might have worried you felt pressured if you just said yes. Is there any time pressure? I looked at both of them. Joe shrugged and looked at Sable, who grinned. Before you're 40 might be smart. Under 30 would be preferable. Sable winked at me. My eggs have a decade or so before we need to worry about viability, but sometime this year would be great. I threw a napkin at her. And here I was worried you needed the answer today or tomorrow. Nah, Jo said as she leaned back in her chair. Well, I might have hoped you'd scream yes and start bawling in joy. This makes more sense. Besides, Sable's right. If you just said yes, I would have worried. This is more you. Tell us when you decide and we'll go from there. I nodded, my thoughts turning inward as I ate and considered the new wrinkle in my life. Children. They would be mine, but not mine. Could I handle that? Did I want to be pregnant? There were so many things to consider that I felt a bit overwhelmed. I spent the evening doing internet searches about being a surrogate. In retrospect, that was a huge mistake. The horror stories that abounded terrified me. They made me want to flee to a mountaintop and never come down again. The pregnancy stories weren't much better. By the time I was done, I'd decided I'd never be pregnant. Who would want to go through that? My panic lasted through the rest of the week. Work kept me busy with samples from random scenes that I needed to test, and I sank into my science brain as a way to distract myself. Cori? I looked up at Naomi's voice through the lab intercom. The investigators are here about the Arizona incident. They requested a meet with you and Caroline. I sighed. Let me finish this and I'll be up. 20 minutes? Got it. Conference room 3C. She clicked off. I finished the titration, recorded the results, saved them, then headed out. I stripped off my lab coat, shoving it in a locker, then looked at Caroline. Come on, they want to ask more questions. He lounged in a dog bed I'd gotten for him and placed outside the lab between the entry doors and the door to the break room and bathrooms. He said it let him monitor who was coming and going, but kept him out of the lab where everyone agreed he didn't need to be. Even him. Labs reeked of chemicals to his sensitive nose.
They want to praise me again. It was a beautiful takedown.
He stretched as he got up. The location of his bed was also the perfect temperature and out of the way. I figured he slept more than monitored anyone, but with cats you never could tell. No clue. Probably just a pro forma thing. I headed for the stairs, taking every opportunity to exercise as I hated working out. Caroline and I needed to go for a hike somewhere. Jo, over the years, had dropped down to 1 yoga class a week, though she and Sable went on walks regularly. I figured she'd start a garden in Albany while looking longingly at the Tudor house. There was something else to consider if I carried their child. Would they want more than one? Anytime I stopped focusing on something intently, all the questions rose back up in my mind, and they started to spin around. Even being faced with interrogators was better than this quagmire of questions without answers. I trotted up to the 3rd floor. The labs were in the basement reception, and conference rooms were on the 1st floor, with offices on the 2nd through 4th floors. I had a nice little office, nothing fancy and no windows, but big enough for a desk, a flat spot for Caroline, a mini fridge, and a bookcase. I grabbed a water, poured some out for Caroline in his bowl, then drank the rest. The lab always dried me out. My mind still was more focused on pregnancy ideas than anything else when I walked into the conference room. That came to a screeching halt as 2 men whirled, staring at me as I walked in. One was dark, almost swarthy, with a bushy mustache that wouldn't have looked out of place as a toupee, though I got a Hispanic vibe from him, not European. He had a badge that I recognized as the Border Patrol. The other was more fireplug than anything, with a barreled chest that made the door look too narrow. The fact that he didn't have a badge told me he was probably Homeland Security. What I didn't have was a clue about why they were here. The lack of any agenda, or even a formal request, just screamed that interagency politics was about to slam into me. Again, I hate this macho crap.
Merlin Monroe, Why did you order your pet to savage that man? Ricardo Martinez was under witness protection.
It should have been a question, but the bellow from the Border Patrol agent made it come out like an accusation. The level of embarrassment his agency must be feeling, and the amount of shit flowing from above was obvious in his tone. 5 years ago, I would have quailed and stammered and tried to reassure them. Now, I had a lot more confidence in myself and those around me. I glanced at Caroline. Did I order you to attack anyone? Caroline looked at me, jumped up on the conference room table, and sprawled out, almost covering it. It wasn't that big of a table, and he was a big cat. His claws came out as he licked them.
No, he was in danger of escaping. That creature.
He managed to hiss out the word, implying Martinez wasn't a man.
Had information about the location of 3 human children, all under the age of 6. Children are to be protected.
Both men paled at Caroline's voice in their minds, as I saw the step back they took. You do know that Caroline is an agent as well, with full choice as to which orders he wishes to follow and which ones he doesn't, I said as I sat down near Caroline's head. And, as a side note, we were never notified that our suspect was in WITSEC, nor were we given any instructions other than he needed to be apprehended for questioning.
And why was a star like you sent after him? That is an egregious display of exceeding the authority of your agency. Had we been properly consulted, we would have taken care of this before it became an issue.
This came from the Homeland Security man, his gruff voice and red hair making him look like the movie stereotype of an Irishman. A star? I'm a draftee who happens to be excellent at my job. The fact that given my power I can go up against almost anyone, and I have a partner who is faster than a horse, we tend to get tagged when people suspected of horrendous crimes try to run. This Martinez, as you call him, fired a gun at me, then was going to jump on a motorcycle and flee. Caroline doesn't like people shooting at me. I believe the notes from the doctors were that he accurately hamstrung our witness. An instantly incapacitating injury, yet not immediately deadly. And I'm not responsible for notifying other agencies. You have an issue with how we did stuff, talk to my boss. I'm sure she'd love to hear your opinion. Naomi would chew them up and spit them out. They both ground their teeth, and I wondered what the man wasn't going to be able to do because he'd been crippled. I didn't really care. He had talked after Caroline detailed exactly what else he could do to a human body. I just verified it was the truth. Terror worked wonders, and Caroline could be scary as all get out. Amazing what seeing a few dead kids will do to your moral compass. As far as I knew, he'd spilled everything he knew.
You damaged someone who was going to lead us to the ring and potentially have delayed numerous ongoing cases. We had assumed that your boss would offer you up as a sacrificial lamb for your agency, but it appears we're going to have to take this up to a directorate level.
The fire plug snarled. I shrugged. Go for it. Again, it is her problem, not mine, and you should have kept closer watch on him and made sure he wasn't hurting anyone. Besides, if you check the notes I provided, you'll see I pulled out every bit of information he had on his contacts. We are done here. I turned and walked out, hearing Caroline's claws scrabble on the table behind me.
Bitch, can you imagine what her kids would be like?
I couldn't tell who muttered that, but the snarl from Caroline had me turning and looking back at them. Powerful, smart, loved, and feistier than a cat. I can't wait to meet them. With a smirk, I continued down the hall, my anger once again driving me to a possibly rash choice. But their comment had me realize the idea of little Joes and Sables sounded wonderful. Nieces and nephews I could spoil and love and never have to worry about their parents abandoning them. The men stopping by my office and accusing me of things had been odd, but there were still a lot of people in law enforcement who treated me with caution after the incident with China and how close those bombs came to detonating in Washington, D.C. How close we came to dying and D.C. turning into a nuclear wasteland still burned in my mind with crystal clarity. All of that meant I wasn't sure about anything anymore, much less my own decision-making ability. I needed another opinion. Chapter 4. Relations with Japan have improved greatly over the last year. The new ruler of China has met multiple times with the Emperor of Japan, and there is a talk of even closer ties. All discussions of trouble between the US and Japan has faded. There's still an air of mystery over what happened at D.C. regarding nuclear bombs, but no trace of nuclear radiation has been found. The investigation has been classified, restricting access to it for at least a decade. House of Emrys Newsletter. You wanted to talk to me? Esmir's tail swayed back and forth like a green snake, her fur, as always, a shade of emerald green that would put gems to shame. Esmir was Caerleon's mother, or Malkin. She was the size of a Shetland pony and screamed regal attitude. You are one of two mothers I know, and as much as I'd like to talk to Marisol, I don't feel it is fair to get her hopes up until I've made a decision. We were in Esmir's realm, a place I'd been a few times before, whereas the glade Bainjarl, my griffin teacher, called home was trees and breezes. Jorgaz, my phoenix friend, had one of flames, fruit, and trees. But Esmir did it differently. Hers was a long, wide savanna, with stones to perch on to see the land and a few large trees that created circles of shade. I could see creatures that looked like deer in the distance, and birds darted from branch to branch in the trees. We were sitting under a tree, me on a blanket, her lounging like the ruler of the area. Caerleon watched some ground rodents that kept poking their heads out of their dens, then back down. His tail lashed back and forth, ears flicking between our conversation and his prey. While I have no issue talking about my pregnancy or the acts before and after, I do not believe I can provide you with much information. A cat carries kids much differently than a human. She sounded bemused, and I thought often that she tolerated us for her son, but she and Marisol still had regular tease. After the fourth time Laurel, the police chief, had been called about the monster in Marisol's house, she started joining in the tease. It must have been an interesting discussion, and the idea of those three conspiring on anything made my skin twitch. I know that, and I figure I'll talk to the doctors and then Marisol if I agree. Esmir snorted at that, but I ignored her and kept talking. I wanted to know about giving children away, or maybe losing them. Caerleon came to me so young, and I know you lost many of your kits. How did you do that without, I don't know, pulling him back? Ah. Her eyes pierced me and shifted uncomfortably. I think you are worrying about nothing. I am? I blinked at her. Why? Cori, I have watched you around children, both human and animal. You find the animals cute and humans puzzling. You are a kind and loving person who puts the needs of others before your own all too often. Yet, you have zero tolerance for the needs of a child. I suspect you will nurse a babe for the first month or two, but more than gladly turn it over to your partners. You are not maternal for all that you are loyal and committed. This child will be a part of all three of you, and if I had to guess, your love and interest will grow as the child does. Oh, I thought about that. The other grandchildren of the Guzmans I'd watched from being born to the ages they were now. And Esmir was correct. I liked them, didn't mind them, but I'd never cooed over the babies or demanded to hold them. They were much more fun now that they were older. In many ways, Caroline had more maternal feelings than I did. And letting Caroline go? Esmir laughed, a rough, coughing purr in my mind and my ears.
You think I could have stopped him? But remember, a 6-week-old cat is about the equivalent of your 5 or 6-year-old, more than old enough to let someone else take care of him. Though you may not have been aware of it, I checked in on him regularly. He is my son, after all, and one of the few mages I have birthed. If you had not treated him well, there would have been consequences.
The words were idle, but I instantly had the desire to see if any mages disappeared after emergence, where they gained a familiar. I would never.
I know. You chose your clan well. Your mates are family to you. This child will be family as well. Do you really think there will be more than a day that you are not part of their life? I suspect you will be more than willing to hand off the child to those you love, and who you know would protect that child with their lives.
I stared at my toes. In other words, I'm being an idiot.
You are being a fussy woman faced with a choice that forces changes to your body and creates a life. I would think less of you if you did not think about this fully. But you made your decision ages ago. This is you resisting what your heart decided in the first second.
Trying to hide my smile, I narrowed my eyes at her. Really?
You would never refuse your loves anything, though it costs you your life. And this is what they want more than anything. A child for them to love.
She was right. Even as I stressed, I had been wondering if I could do it, not if I would. So many things could go wrong, but I wouldn't be alone. Let's go home, Caroline. I rose and scratched Esmir's ear. All the cats seemed to feel scratches were acceptable payment for their attention.
I will get those rodents someday,
he murmured, looking back at the meerkats peeking their heads up.
Then I shall have a fine snack,
he muttered as he rose, following me back to the house in Albany. A thought and a step, and I was home. Jo hummed in the kitchen, while Sable was in the dining room. She'd been playing with painting and using her water abilities. So far, it was interesting. Leaning against the doorway jamb, I watched them for a bit, trying to see them as a stranger might. Luminous dark skin, muscles and curves with a touch of age starting to soften them. Hair twisted in braids and held in buns to stay out of the way. Both wore tank tops and shorts, humming and bopping their heads to the music playing in the house, courtesy of Hamadia's speaker system. Yes, I pitched my voice loud enough to be heard over the music, watching them with amusement and so much love. Sable's head jerked up, her dark eyes locked on me. Jo, kill the music? Jo turned, her face lighting up when she saw me. A frown crossed her face as Sable waved her hand. Fine. A quick 2 steps and Jo killed the stereo her phone was connected to. The music playlist paused mid-note. What's up? What did you say? Sable asked, straightening up and walking towards me a bit. A smile crossed my face. Yes. Jo glanced between the two of us, then her eyes locked on mine. Yes to the question? Yes to the baby? Her voice rising in pitch and talking faster as she stood frozen in a strange mix of hope and fear. That would be the yes. I'll carry the baby. Yes! Ah! Jo's yell made the music earlier seem quiet. She did her happy hip dance, but Sable flowed around the boxes and grabbed me in a hug, so tight I feared for my ribs. but I didn't mind. I hugged her back, just as excited. Thank you. Thank you. She murmured in my ear, and I felt wetness drop on my shoulder. I pulled back and kissed her forehead. I love you both. Did you really think I'd say no? By this time, Jo had made her way out of the kitchen and added her arms to the mix. Think? Said Sable. Maybe not. Feared? Oh, yes. And I didn't want a stranger. I wanted my partner. My joined. Her voice remained soft as she wrapped her other arm around Jo. We're going to have a baby. Yes, we are! Jo's arms squeezed us tight. I laughed, joy bubbling up in my heart. I'm making lots of assumptions, mainly that you two have researched this until you can quote numbers and figures. Sable broke our hug and gave me an affronted glare. Of course I have. This is important. I have all the information saved and collated. That sounded like the Sable I loved. Given that we can't do this the old-fashioned way, I said, waving at the three of us. What is the next step? Steps. There are so many steps. While magic makes some of them easier and more expensive, the first one is your parents. Sable directed this comment to Jo. And Sanchez. Jo sighed. Asking Stinky for this favor is going to be a pain. You know there isn't anyone else to ask, and if he's going to be the donor of our baby, don't you think maybe we should stop calling him the nickname he earned when he was 12? Sable countered, smiling at her wife. Point. I'll try to remember. I'm still having a hard time believing he's all grown up and responsible and stuff. Jo muttered, pulling out her phone. You? I'm having a hard time believing we are, I said, laughing. Cori, you were always a grown-up and you know it. Jo made a funny face at me while she called her mother. Mommy, can we come over for dinner? We need to talk to everyone. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I had no doubt Marisol was ecstatic. She understood why we moved to Albany. Living rent and mortgage-free was a huge benefit, but she hated us being so far away. I think the only thing that kept her from fretting more was Caroline being able to move her through the realms, to visit us when we asked. No one liked me sidestepping them for anything less than a true emergency. I still didn't understand why it felt so different for me versus my passenger. Yeah, we'll be up there by 5. Can you ask Sanchez if he's free? We wanted to talk to him too. A pause. No, Mommy, we just need to ask him for a favor. Jo had that mischievous smile that I loved. See you in a while. She hung up and looked at me. Thank you. This is going to be the best thing ever. Even better than my workshop. Her smile was so bright and wide it hurt my heart. I hope so. You love that workshop. I grinned. Himadia had helped Jo extend the garage so she could keep her motorcycle there and work on it a bit. It wasn't a full workshop like she wanted. However, her job doing mechanical part creation for some pretty impressive machines soothed her creation bug. I still expected her to quit and start her own machine shop, but so far she'd been pretty quiet about what she wanted to do down the road. I went back up to my room to change. You coming with us to let the Guzmans know? Caroline was stretched out on my bed.
Of course. She saves the good stuff for me. Though maybe you should take the queens there with sidestepping. If you do, they will not be as interested in eating, and I will get more.
I threw my shirt at him. You are a greedy jerk.
Smart. Marisol has excellent food.
He purred and stretched out further. In the kitchen, all of us dressed up and ready to go. Parents, think we'll be good ones? Jo asked as she leaned against Sable. I think the 3 of us will be the best ones. Sable kissed Jo softly. I know it. A few days ago, I might have protested that. But now, I just smiled. The idea of having kids was slowly making more sense in my soul. Sable moved over and took my hand, and I looked at her. a bit surprised. They were affectionate with me, and I with them, but this seemed more serious. Cori, I'm going to repeat this as many times as I need until you believe me. Well, us. Joe draped an arm over Sable's shoulder, smiling at me. They will be our children. We are joined, which means your children are ours, and vice versa. I know this was never anything you thought about, but there isn't anyone else I'd ever want as our third. I managed not to cry, but her words and the look of love on Joe's face sat in my mind as we walked into Marisol and Henry's house. Chapter 5.
The draft is slavery. Revolt now. Quit giving up years of your life to the government for nothing. Demand equal rights as citizens. You are taxpayers also. Why should you be punished? Give up your magic and quit the draft.
Freedom from magic. Joe led the way into the house, opening the door to the aroma of cumin, tomatoes, and chilies. I smiled as we traipsed in. While I was sure of my choice, I had expectations of great entertainment at her family's reaction. Being the only daughter meant Joe had always been expected to have kids. I think that was the one thing that had disappointed her parents about her preferring women. This should delight them. But it was the conversation with Sanchez I was looking forward to. Caroline followed us in, his nose high in the air. "Mommy, we're home," Joe sang out as we entered. The table was set, and Marisol stepped out of the kitchen smiling.
My girls!
She exclaimed, coming over and giving us all hugs and kisses on the cheek.
Come, food is ready. Henry and Sanchez will be here shortly.
She reached down and scratched Caroline.
How is my gorgeous boy? I saved some shrimp and sausage just for you.
That cat is so spoiled, I muttered.
As is right. I am the glorious focus of not only one mage, but 3. It is right I am rewarded for my superior choices.
He leaned into Marisol's touch before slipping out to the living room. He knew better than to be underfoot while she was in the kitchen. That resulted in stepped-on tails, dropped dishes, and a pissed-off cook. How is his business going? I asked, curious. Sanchez had started his own towing company, giving preference to the Guzman's shop and lowered rates if you wanted to be taken there. Last I heard, he had 3 trucks and even an office attached to the Guzmans. In other words, like the rest of us, he had grown up. Marisol's smile lit up her face, and the red of her fire tattoo seemed to shine with extra joy.
Really well. He might open up another location. Last we talked, he was still trying to figure out the logistics. He doesn't want to take out a loan.
I poked a bit, still worried about the request we were about to make. No love life at the moment?
Pfft, that boy wouldn't know settling down if it bit him. Why can't he follow in Marco Apollo's footsteps? No, he's still all social butterfly.
Marisol's voice held love and exasperation, but with 3 grandkids, 2 girls and a boy, she didn't have much to complain about. Laughter drifted in from the dining room where Joe and Sable were putting food on the table. They both seemed a bit manic to my eyes, and from the glance towards that room from Marisol, I think she sensed something too.
Your son has arrived,
Sanchez bellowed from the garage door. That comment was followed by Henry in a much lower voice.
We are home, mi corazon.
He emerged from the hallway and came into the kitchen, boots in hand and overalls covered in grease and dirt. Henry's eyes were for his wife, and he leaned over and kissed her, making sure only his lips touched her.
Let me shower, and I'll be out.
Marisol looked at Henry the same way Joe looked at Sable, and I watched, feeling almost voyeuristic.
And this is why I haven't settled down,
Sanchez muttered in my ear.
I'm not settling for anything less than that.
I laughed as I turned and gave him a hug. He returned the hug, squeezing me tightly. From the skinny kid annoying his sister to a teenager who would rather game, he'd become a strong young man. A few years older than Joe, he had the dark Hispanic coloring, but a stronger and sharper face than his father, plus 3 inches.
So, what is the occasion that you 3 ladies needed my presence?
Sanchez raised the question after we'd sat down and plates had been filled. Dinner tonight was paella with shrimp, sausage, and lots of peppers. All the Guzmans had added more jalapenos to theirs. I kept to my much lower levels of spice. Caroline had his own seat at the table and was busy inhaling the shrimp that he dipped in hot sauce first. That cat made no sense. Joe and Sable exchanged looks, then glanced at me. I shrugged. It was their story to tell in the manner they wanted to tell it. Just that interaction was enough to cause a slowdown in the clinking dinner sounds.
Is something wrong?
Marisol asked, a groove of worry creasing her forehead. Joe shook her head. No, just trying to figure out where to start and how to explain. She wet her lips and sat up a bit straighter.
She wants to use Sanchez's seed to create a child for Cori to carry, though apparently without the enjoyable part of procreation.
Caroline didn't even look up from his shrimp as everyone whipped their heads to stare at him. Joe and Sable horrified, the rest just confused. I should have locked him in the trunk, I muttered.
And I would have left. Do you think I would miss delicacies such as this for any reason?
He held up one of the shrimp before tossing it in his mouth and purring as he ate.
My seed? Wait, you want me to father my sister's baby?
Sanchez sounded horrified and stunned at the same time. Caroline! Sable hissed out the word and then covered her face. We were going to ace into it, explain everything, not drop a bomb.
Humans overcomplicate. It is progeny. That is always good, though sex is more fun than this healer-guided fertilization you talk about.
He grabbed another shrimp.
But either way, children are good.
I think I'd like some explanations,
Marisol said weakly, both hands flat on the table as if the world was spinning on her. That started the explanation why Joe couldn't have a child. A firestorm of horror and shock followed as she explained. Even Sanchez looked stunned.
Joe, I'm so sorry. It never occurred to me what you gave up for me, for all of us.
Sanchez's voice shook. He'd been there that day. He had almost died. Guys, it has been, what, almost 7 years? Joe had to count for a minute. At that time, it wasn't even a choice. And do you really think I keep my ability to have kids at the risk of 20,000 people dying? At least I think that was how many I would not have been able to reach if I hadn't used everything in my offerings. It wasn't even a question then, and something I've known for a long time. So being upset about it now is a bit ridiculous. It took a minute, but everyone settled down, and they explained Sable's risk if she carried a child, and then the logical decision to ask me to be their surrogate. I'd spent the time during all this eating the delicious food and listening. The Guzmans turned to me, their gazes searching.
Cori, you are okay with carrying a child for them?
Marisol said hesitantly.
Pregnancy can be rough, and I don't know that you've ever talked about having kids.
I know, but it would be their kids. Our kids. And why not? Who else would they ask? At the end of the day, that was what it boiled down to. Who else would I ever want to do this for? Marisol stared at her plate, the food having grown cold as we all talked. She heated it up with her magic, and I smiled. You've been using magic more, I said.
I realized you are right. We get conditioned to not use it. Well, I have all this hair. Why not use it for things to make my life easier?
She nodded at the shrimp.
Being able to parboil shrimp on the plate is rather nice.
Sanchez was rubbing his face.
Let me get this right. My sperm, Sable's eggs, and Cori's uterus?
He gave all of us a wary look.
And I wouldn't be the child's father, just his uncle?
Or her uncle. Jo grinned at him while she spoke. But yes, I mean, I have no desire to hide that, but you don't want to be a father yet. And this is for us. This child will have 3 people doting on her. I don't think feeling unloved will be an issue.
And 2 cats. I believe Esmir is excited at the idea of watching a human kit grow up.
Esmir knows? Marisol asked, an odd note of hurt in her voice. That would be me. I wanted to talk to another mother, but you and Esmir are the ones I know best, and I didn't want to get your hopes up. Esmir has a different viewpoint on having children. I studied my food. At that point, I still didn't know if I was going to say yes or no. It was a bit of a shock when they asked me.
That does make sense. And you are correct. My hopes would have skyrocketed. But there is no guarantee this will work, you know.
Marisol had an uncharacteristic look of worry on her face.
The embryos may not take, or worse, you may miscarry.
I knew she'd had miscarriages, and my heart clenched at that idea. Maybe being a mage would make it easier to keep the baby healthy. Sable nodded. We are assuming my eggs are good, and that Sanchez has healthy sperm. We want to get a genetic test on both and make sure there aren't any hidden time bombs. But this all depends on Sanchez saying yes. If you don't, well, we will need to go back and think about how we want to handle this. She looked at him, a sad smile on her face. If you turn us down, we have a lot of decisions to make. Sanchez nodded slowly.
I'm still shocked, but I guess I don't have a reason to say no. It also keeps the child genetically a Guzman.
He had a questioning look on his face as he gazed at his parents, then back to Jo and Sable. Which was part of why we asked you, Sable said with a smile, her hand touching Sanchez. This way the child will really be your grandchild. She looked at Marisol and Henry as she said that. Marisol looked at Henry, then back to Sanchez, and her head bobbed up and down in a quick little gesture.
Okay, then the answer is yes. I guess I'm going to be an uncle, daddy, uncle, whatever. I'll do it.
His good cheer sounded a bit forced, and I wanted to tell him it would all be okay.
Now what?
Jo and Sable squealed, and I mean loud enough that I winced, and Caroline's ears laid flat.
Why must you hit such an unpleasant pitch? I understand young ones doing that. You are not young.
He spat the words as he looked mournfully at his empty plate.
I thank you for the excellent victuals, Malk and Marisol. Now I shall go nap while those 2 talk about overly complicated things.
His tail brushed Marisol's hand, and then he left the table to stare out the sliding glass doors to the backyard and groom. Everyone watched him go, and Henry sighed.
If any of you kids had an ego like that, I would have paddled your butts until you couldn't sit, and then your real punishment would begin.
I heard that,
Caroline said while cleaning his muzzle. The late evening sun shone off his red coat, and he looked like a regal being, not the spoiled, overgrown house cat that he was. We giggled, and like that, the tension vanished.
So, now what?
Marisol asked, and Jo and Sable began to gush. Much of it I had no idea of. They had put a lot of work into this. There was an in vitro fertility specialist here in Atlanta they wanted to work with, but they had found a mage OBGYN, Anna Lobdale, in New York, near Albany, and had verified she was taking new patients. When we decided to start the process, there would be drugs for Sable to get her eggs, then drugs for me to ensure implantation, and so much other stuff that it seemed overwhelming. I closed my eyes and reminded myself that I trusted them. After all, women gave birth every day. How hard could it be? My phone rang, and I let them talk, taking it out back to answer it. Cori Munroe? The number wasn't in my contact list and hadn't been flagged as spam.
Yes, this is Gloria Atkins. I'm calling from the Department of State about the Medal Award ceremony.
Oh, yes? I rolled my eyes and leaned against the wall.
We wanted to discuss the plan. We're still trying to confirm the dates and coordinate it with all parties involved.
I rubbed my head. That sounds great, but can we do this all via email? It allows me to make sure I have dates right, and this way everything is in writing so there's no misunderstanding.
Of course, that would work out well. If you provide your email, I'll forward you all the details.
I rattled off my email address and said goodbye. With a smile, I walked back into the house and the discussion about the process and the doctors they had researched. By the time we left, they had my life planned, appointments made to start the process, and I tried not to panic again at this idea. But the joy on everyone's faces ensured that I would do this. I'd face down dragons. I could give birth.
You will be a fine Malkin and an even better pack member. You worry too much.
I glanced at Caroline out of the corner of my eye. Just wait until I'm in labor. It's your tail I'm holding on to. Chapter 6.
In the last 2 years, the survival rate of mages making it through the draft has increased by almost 50%. The reason for this is unknown, but it provides more resources to be called upon down the road. Don't forget that previously drafted mages are usually used to making money and can be seduced into jobs that will necessitate large offerings and help private sector research.
Internal OMO memo. Work distracted me from my decisions. Sable and Joe went to the first appointment to collect eggs and fertilize them. Sanchez had already done his part, and the genetic tests came back clean. My appointment was scheduled a few days after that. They had given Sable some drugs to help her ovulate. I theoretically understood the process, but it was somehow different when it was someone I loved. Part of me was excited, part terrified, so I focused on work. My work week was mostly lab testing, which allowed me to leave work at a realistic time. Before, it gave Caroline and me time to hike, explore the area in Albany. Now, it gave me time to walk and try to work through my feelings and fears. I wanted to do this, but there were still a lot of emotions wrapped up inside me. Days blended together, and I swung between being completely focused on work or staring off into space. Before I knew it, the week of implantation had arrived. I stretched, the quiet of the lab soothing. I tended to focus on biological and chemical samples. Most of the time, the samples were from cold cases, where they didn't think I'd find anything. Often, I didn't, but there were enough wins under my belt for them to keep handing them to me. The multiple issues with chemicals had made me go back and take more chemistry classes. I could probably qualify for a secondary degree in chemistry at this point, but the knowledge rather than the paper was the important part. Munroe, I need you. Naomi's voice snapped through the intercom. Okay, I'll be up in a bit. I saved what I'd been working on, a group of bacteria samples that had caused widespread food poisoning, but wasn't a familiar strand of listeria. 3 people died from the poisoning. 5 were still in the hospital. Multiple groups had samples, and while no one expected me to figure it out first, I still needed to play with vectors and other aspects regarding the growth patterns. Needless to say, lab safety protocol was more important than rushing up there. 10 minutes later, I knocked on the door to Naomi's office. You needed me? Caroline followed me up and almost instantly flopped down to lay against the wall. He'd been busy chasing squirrels in Albany in the evenings while I read or worked on learning to knit. It wasn't going well so far, but I was determined to knit a baby blanket. It gave me motivation. Come on in. She looked up at me and smiled as she said it. I'd seen her mad and happy, and this was her business neutral. I took a seat. the door still open, as I waited for her. I've got a few things. First, I'm officially reprimanding you. My temper bubbled as she raised her hand, waving her finger at me. Cori, don't have your cat help bring in dangerous felons again, if you know they are in witness protection and might have ties to a larger ring. You might upset pretentious jerks, and that would be horrible. Her voice was stern, but her rolled eyes killed any resentment rising inside me. By the time she finished, I was fighting to keep my face straight. Now that you've been reprimanded, here's your official thank you from the FBI regarding the information you pulled out of his skull. They shut down 3 rings and have evidence to make over 40 arrests. Naomi slid an envelope across the desk to me. This I've noted in your file. The reprimand, for some reason, didn't get saved. I snorted. Naomi had no patience for fools, and these guys qualified. All that just to tell me this? And to officially reprimand you? She reminded me with a grin. It faded as she continued. But no. I've got a case, and you've been requested, she said, frowning at her computer. I have? That was rare. Usually I was sent with a team or as a general help request, and Naomi decided who was best suited for that. Any issue heading to Quantico and working with a Stephen Alexant? My laughter answered her question before she could finish. No, he and his partner are my mentors. Technically, I still owe him assistance with research and whatnot. Sounds fun.
Good people, if overly emotional.
Caroline didn't stop making sure his tale was perfect. Ah, then this will work. Anything going on next week? Yes, I need Tuesday off. I've got a doctor's appointment. She nodded and typed it into the system. So noted. How much longer to finish your test with the bacteria? Another week, but mostly it is a variant of Listeria, just different enough the tests aren't picking it up. That sounds good. Then work here Monday, Tuesday you're off, and on Wednesday head to Quantico. If you know him, he can tell you where to meet him. I nodded at each part of her sentence, adding things to my phone to keep me on schedule. Will do. Any idea what this is about? No. He asked if you were available to assist with an odd case. She shrugged. Normally, I'd press for more, but since you seem fine with the request and it has been quiet, I don't have any issue with you going. Sounds good. I'll ping him this weekend. Excellent. Let me know if he wants you to exceed your authority. Remember, you can stick your nose into things, but anything else you call for the people in charge in that area. So, more pretentious jerks? Exactly, she said with a grin. We laughed, and I headed out. It was close enough to the end of the day that I just went home. I grabbed my bag and made sure I swiped out of the building before turning down an alley. When it was clear, I sidestepped to the house in Albany. Once home, I looked at the mess of my bedroom. I'd been so busy with everything, it had been easier to leave stuff in piles. But now it was starting to annoy me. My wardrobe had clothes shoved in it, and a laundry basket sat next to it with more clothes. I was an adult. Why was I still living like I was in college? I needed a better closet layout. Hamadia, can you help me for a minute? I said out loud. Caroline was out back, enjoying the coolness of the shade under the trees. Or chasing things. There was much in my life I didn't need or want to know. A swirl of gray-green appeared in the room next to me, and Hamadia took shape. With a figure resembling a waif girl of 16, her round green teeth, slanted eyes, and leafy hair screamed she wasn't human. "Cori!" Hamadia said as she finished materializing. She rotated slowly, examining my bedroom. Trying to see it from her perspective, I saw a room with pale cream walls, the baseboards painted a slate gray, and a bed with rich burgundy covers. The pictures on the walls popped in blue and green, while copper was the main metal accent in the room. Then there was the neon yellow and brown dog bed Caroline loved. I tried to cover it with a dark blue blanket or a gray throw, but he pulled them off. The clash of neon yellow and his ruby red fur always made my head hurt, but he loved it. He either dragged it under the bed or out into the middle of the room, at least when he wasn't sleeping on my bed. Do you like? Most of the furniture was what James had left, but I needed a better closet, and it was all built in. We'd learned that all the built-in shelves and drawers were a part of her. It explained the beautiful details that encompassed the house. Rather than pulling them out, we just asked her to change them. It created less damage and greater control. It had taken me months to do what decorating I had managed.
It is colorful. It reminds me of Georgas and his feathers,
she said. I looked around after her comment and nodded. With all the various colors, I can see the resemblance. I'll have to ask his opinion next time he's over. Are you willing to change how the closet is laid out?
You do not like?
She seemed almost hurt. It is excellent for a guy. I have a few more clothes and need a different structure. One lesson learned early on by all of us was that her feelings and ego had to be appealed to at all times. It didn't bug me. I was criticizing her body after all. I'd want people to be nice about critiquing me too.
Ah, yes, that makes sense. What would you like to change?
Her hurt disappeared and she lit up at the idea of having something to create. I gave her my list, a few more drawers, some shelves for sweaters, and double clothing rods to hang things on. Then I stepped back and watched in awe. None of the rules of magic I'd learned in college or from experience made sense for what Hamadia could do. But it didn't matter. She did what she did, and within her sphere of power, she all but ruled supreme. Wood sank back into the wall until the whole space was empty of everything. Can you make it bigger? I injected a hopeful tone into my voice. I may not be the clothes horse Joe was, but still I needed more than a tiny closet from the early 1900s. A bit more room for my clothes would make my life easier. Hamadia tilted her head one way, then the other.
In real space? No, but I can extend it into my space and provide extra room.
She paused, her face pulling down into a sour look no human face could have duplicated.
I do not know what you need.
I started to say never mind, but the idea of a large closet, the kind you see in magazines, sparked an idea in me. The worst that would happen was nothing. Give me a minute. I dug out my laptop and in a minute had the image of a drool-worthy closet. It had drawers and shelves, hangers, and racks for shoes. I liked it because it had enough space for me to organize search and rescue gear and set up a workspace to make sure I could reload my kits. Even if it wasn't an S&R job, I still traveled with a kit. It had prevented some serious complications. Can you do this? I showed her the picture. The sour look brightened like a flower unfolding.
Interesting. It might take me a while.
No hurry. I still have lots of work to do. And I did. Journals to read, a baby blanket to fight with, and apparently a baby to plan for. That still took me by surprise. She nodded and faded away. I looked around and shrugged. I had plenty to do. My clothes were stacked in tubs next to the too small closet, with the S&R gear that I desperately needed to organize, and my med supplies. It was one of the reasons I'd hesitated about agreeing to the pregnancy. I hated the idea of not being available to work, but hopefully it would only be about 4 months that I would be restricted from field work. I needed to research the pregnancy stuff more, but right now, I had too much to do.
It's ready.
Hamadia's voice right behind my ear had me squeaking in surprise as Caroline laughed in my mind. While I could feel her approach if I concentrated, I'd been in the middle of wrestling boxes down to the recycle pile. Joe might be able to use air to levitate, but every time I tried, they just flew around and created even more work for me to pick up. Carrying was easier. Oh, great. Give me a minute. I got the boxes down to the curb, then headed back up. Caroline deigned to rise up and follow me. He'd found all our possessions amusing, though he'd growled when I suggested we could dump his brushes. The cat was a hedonist, and his stuff was the only important stuff. She waited for me, doing her weird float, one pointy foot supporting her.
Does this work?
I stuck my head in the opening, and my jaw dropped. Not only was there everything I had daydreamed about, she provided a bench to sit on and remove shoes, a place for all of Caroline's toys and brushes, and space for more clothes than I'd ever own. Oh, wow. This is incredible. Joe and Sable will be so envious. The joy on her face made me smile. Yes, I love it. You up for doing more?
Yes, this is fun. I like the pictures. Can you show me more?
I might have created a remodeling monster, but I wasn't sure I cared. You know, we are planning on having a baby. We will need a nursery, I suggested softly. Flowers bloomed down her arms, and she spun in a whirlwind. A child! Her voice lilted with joy. I laughed and called for Joe and Sable. This would all work out. I just knew it. Chapter 7. The wall that went up around Japan lasted for 3 weeks. The death toll has not been verified, but at least 5 mages are rumored to have died from offering too much. Research is requested as to how to minimize the cost and implement on a smaller scale. Multiple companies are interested in this level of magic for security reasons. Bonuses will be offered. Tomes of Wonder. Tuesday morning, I paced in my bedroom. The implantation was today, and I was about to crawl out of my skin. Joe and Sable were crashing at the apartment. The best IVR place was in Atlanta, even if the obstetrician they wanted was in Albany. Sable's eggs had been extracted, and the clinic was ready to implant them. I'd been taking the drugs they prescribed to help ensure implantation. To make me pregnant. The idea was causing me to panic, and I needed to get hold of it before I sidestepped to Joe and Sable. That was one thing I'd checked with Esmir, that my sidestepping didn't affect the embryo or baby. She'd assured me life didn't have any issues with magic of that type, only advanced technology. I made a mental note to never need a pacemaker. I like sidestepping. It meant I really never needed to drive. I got this. Women get pregnant daily. They give birth daily. You can do this. It's normal and part of being a woman. I took a deep breath. You have magic, friends who love you, an in vitro specialist who is a mage, an obstetrician who is a mage, and you survived everything else. It will be fine.
You are worrying over nothing. My queens will produce glorious children. You are my queen. You won't fail at anything.
Caroline pressed against me, purring, and I rubbed his ears. You are biased.
Accurate, but we should go.
He was right, as usual. I took a deep breath. I could do this. I stepped over to the apartment to find Joe and Sable sitting at the table, their hands wrapped around coffee. They looked as tense as I did, and part of me unwound. Together, we had this. I walked over and dropped a kiss on both of their heads. Rare for me, but my heart felt ready to burst. We have this. We are going to be parents. That we are. Joe shot up, the chair screeching as it slid back. Which means we better go to get pregnant? That just sounds wrong, Sable muttered as she rose. She'd gotten the eggs extracted fine, but the drugs to increase ovulation had made her nauseous for the last few days, and she was just now getting it under control. Though if I react this way to this little part, I'm glad I'm not going to be pregnant. Are you trying to freak me out? Because that is the way to do it, I said as we headed down to the street. The ride share waited for us, and we piled in, rattling off the address. Nerves jangled as the ride took an eternity in a few minutes. Caroline purred loud enough we could hear him over the car engine. The driver had paled when he saw Caroline, but didn't protest. That was better than most reactions. Getting out at the office building, it all seemed surreal. I'd go in there, just me, and come out pregnant, responsible for another life. I swallowed down my doubts and fears and focused on knowing I was loved, and I'd be bringing a child into the world who would be smothered in love and never abandoned. The waiting room was done in cool blues and greens, and the feeling of odd serenity made my skin crawl. I closed my eyes and repeated my mantra. I can do this. We walked forward, and I let Joe and Sable take the lead. My hands stayed on Caroline's head as an anchor and support. Guzman, we have an appointment, Joe said, her voice a forced lightness that I knew covered nerves. The receptionist didn't take her eyes off Caroline, who seemed a gleaming ember with his ruby fur in the midst of all the serenity. Okay, 1 minute. Are all of you going in? She glanced down at the computer, then back up. It is supposed to be a sterile environment? Her words stuttered out.
Why does everyone assume I am dirty?
Caroline growled. And I thought the girl might have a heart attack or pass out as she paled to the point her ivory blouse looked dark compared to her skin. They don't furball. They assume you're covered in fur. Stay out here. Really, it will be weird human stuff. Joe scratched his ear as she spoke. His tail lashed, but he sank down in the middle of the room.
Very well. I shall wait and listen. If you call, I will be there. Fur or no fur.
I know. I rubbed his head, then turned. My body tensed. We ready? The receptionist nodded at the door as it opened, and a nurse forced a smile at us. Come on, I'll help you get ready. She led us to a small room. You are receiving the embryos? She looked at me and I nodded, my throat suddenly tight and refusing to make sounds. Excellent. Here's your gown and sit on the table here. The doctor will be in shortly. Are these two ladies staying? Yes, they both said in stereo, and I bobbed my head, glad I wouldn't have to talk. The doctor will be here shortly. She left me with a last spooked glance at us before shutting the door. Joe shook her head. I swear, some people have dogs the size of small horses as a familiar. You'd think a cat the size of a dog wouldn't be that big of a deal. Cori, you okay? Sable wrapped her arm around me, her eyes dark. You don't have to do this. I almost grabbed at that. The need to run back to my uncomplicated, unpregnant existence was strong, but equally strong was the desire to have their children be a part of us, not a stranger. Everyone got pregnant unprepared the first time. I could do this. I'm good. I stripped quickly into the stupid hospital gown, then sat there on the table, feeling stupid and exposed. Joe held my right hand and Sable my left. From the strength of their grips, I knew they were as tense as I was. Dr. Singh came in and nodded at us. He was middle-aged, East Indian, with gray hair at his temples pulled back into a long tail at the nape of his neck, and his mage tattoo gleaming in silver and yellow on his temple. I'd met him before when we had our first meeting, and he explained the process.
Ladies, I'm happy to tell you that we have 5 viable embryos. With IVF, there is always a strong chance of the embryos not implanting, so you need to decide how many you want to try now and how many you want to hold back for later.
I am not having quintuplets. My voice was adamant. That was not an option. Joe snorted. That isn't my preference either. What do you recommend?
3 implanted usually means about a 15% chance of twins, 5% chance of triplets, and 65% chance of a healthy baby.
And a 15% chance of failure? I asked, worrying gripping me.
Normally, yes. Pregnancy isn't a sure thing,
but I can help up the odds. He tapped the side of his head where the order tattoo sat. I can encourage the implanting, but still, your body is the one that is going to decide. I chewed my lip. Triplets sounded exhausting, but then we'd have all the children at once. That didn't sound so bad, and it meant we'd probably get one. If I didn't hate being pregnant, then we could try again. All the possibilities swirled around in my mind. 3? Sable asked, looking at me. I swallowed hard. The odds were it would be 1. 3, though, would be doable, if awkward. I nodded my head in a jerky manner, the whole thing feeling insane. 3, I said, my voice cracking the tiniest bit as I squeezed their hands.
Excellent choice. He gave us a big smile. You've been taking the meds for the last few days?
He directed this question to me, and I nodded, my hands gripping Joe's and Sable's so hard I was vaguely surprised they weren't protesting. Dr. Singh nodded, giving me a hard look.
You sure about this? Normally I don't work with surrogates who haven't already had at least one pregnancy. But you aren't exactly a surrogate, are you? Though I am worried about your lack of sexual experience.
Oddly, the question made me relax, and I heard the sighs of relief as my hands loosened on theirs. My nose wrinkled. Thank you, but no, it doesn't even interest me. But this will be our child, and women get pregnant all the time. I can do this. He looked at me a long time, and for a moment I wondered if he wasn't a soul mage as opposed to order.
Yes, I believe you can.
He clapped his hands together and stuck his head out the door, saying something. He turned to wash his hands and put on gloves as a nurse came in carrying a tray with medical equipment on it, and I suspected the embryos.
This is going to be a bit tight with all of us in here, but this is how it will go. Joe and Sable, you should be able to stand in that corner and see the ultrasound. Nurse Pine will be helping guide me with the ultrasound while I implant them. It will feel a little uncomfortable, like a rough pap smear, but we will be able to verify the implantation. Once that is done, we'll snap pictures, your first ones. Then you need to lie here for about 15 minutes to give your body a bit of time to adjust. After that, you will officially be pregnant.
He talked as he got ready and helped me lay back. My hand felt cold as Joe and Sable had to move away, and I slipped my feet into the stirrups for the process. I wanted to close my eyes and ignore it all, but I also wanted to know every step. So I forced my head to turn and watch the ultrasound. I could see the baster. I knew that wasn't the name, but still, nudging the side of my uterus. He frowned, and I could sense an offering being made. Why did you offer? I asked, curious.
Healing. It is a pattern aspect. They teach it to you in med school.
His voice was distracted as he didn't take his eyes off the monitor.
All mages get a full semester of how to use your magic with healing. Some of the best surgeons in the world are mages. I'm helping the cells adhere to the lining in your womb. It looks like it is at the perfect thickness for implantation.
The room fell silent as we watched. Then he pulled back, pulling the tool out of me.
Done. Congratulations. You are pregnant.
Joe and Sable squealed a bit as the nurse printed off pictures of the blob on the screen. I lay there in the room, listening to the sounds around me, and placed my hands over my stomach, wondering that it was so easy to change the world.
Now, it might take a day or two for your body to realize, so don't go running any marathons. Remember, you may see some bloody discharge. If you have severe cramping, come back and see me. I've done what I can to ensure a successful implant, but your body still has a mind of its own. Any questions?
I had a million, but none that I could figure out how to ask. I mutely shook my head, and he left. Joe and Sable held my hands, babbling at me in excitement and worry. The words washed over me like a wave of love and support, and I reached out to Caroline. I'm pregnant.
You will be an excellent Malkin. I have faith in your magnificence.
His voice came back in an approving rumble, and I started to laugh, sharing his comment with Joe and Sable. Joe grinned and kissed my forehead.
He is right. As usual, you are magnificent.
Maybe, maybe not. But either way, my life was going to be drastically different. I couldn't wait. Chapter 8. Yet another airplane crash was reported of the Bearing 777s this week. This plane was crossing from the China Sea to Australia and disappeared after a short mayday. The investigation is still continuing, but no survivors have been found. In other news, the newest fashion for mages is brilliant blue hair. It has been confirmed that dye doesn't affect genetic offerings at all. Daily News. We talked late into the night Tuesday. We decided not to tell my job about the possible pregnancy until we were past the first trimester, and I was showing. If it didn't work, we didn't want to have to explain to anyone, not even Joe's parents. Stinky didn't know when we would try, so we'd just keep it to ourselves until then. That also meant not telling Indira or Stephen. Wednesday morning, I showed up at Stephen's office dressed in simple black slacks, a knit top, and a large shirt, as well as my messenger bag. The last year or so, I'd settled into my style, and it almost felt like me. At this point, they could deal with my style or not. I walked into the office, approaching the security guard, Caroline by my side. As usual, Caroline got a second glance and widening of the eyes. Cori Munroe, here to see Agent Alexant. Technically, I could say I was an agent too, but mostly it was fun to hold that back until I needed it. My badge was tucked away in my bag near my phone. I could grab it easily. 1 minute. I turned and looked at the area outside the lobby windows. The rideshare had checked with me twice before bringing me here. I didn't have any place to sidestep to near the FBI. Besides, they tended to get upset when people got into their secure locations without ID. I'd stepped to a place near the State Department and paid the outrageous fare to get taken here.
Cori, good to see you.
I turned to see Stephen approaching and smiled. Part of me wanted to blurt out the change in my status, but the fear of jinxing it stopped me. It also made me check to see if there was a Murphy's cloak on me. The last thing I needed was to make my own life worse. "Stephen," I said as I gave him a hug.
Caroline,
he said with a nod. Caroline flipped a tail, stalking next to me. He'd been odd since it was official, but had, as far as I knew, not told even his mother about my pregnancy. We chatted about inconsequential items and promised to get to dinner more often now that I lived in Albany. Not that distance really was an issue, but it meant we could get there easier with Joe and Sable. He ushered me to an office that had bookshelves full of books about investigations, true crime, and FBI manuals. He didn't rate a window, but the 4 large-screen TVs all showing different scenery made it almost not matter. He had a small table with 2 chairs, a desk, and 2 other tables. With a wave, he pointed me to the chair at the table and grabbed a coffee pot and mugs from a place behind his desk.
I figured you'd want coffee.
Thank you. I'd had some before I left, but not enough to make me happy. He pushed the mug to me, and I added my cream and sugar. He did the same, though his was black with a touch of sugar, and he settled into the other chair. I'm guessing you didn't want me here just for coffee. Not that I'm complaining. Kona Blue? Caroline had sprawled against the door, ensuring no one would be able to push the door open if he didn't move. Glancing at him, you'd be sure he was moments from falling asleep instead of listening intently.
I'd not dare serve you anything less.
His smile had a teasing aspect to it, and I grinned. Smart man. So spill, what is all the cloak and dagger about? Stephen settled in, holding the coffee close to his nose.
What is your background in virology?
That had me pausing for a minute before I took a sip of my steaming coffee. Enjoying the rich flavor gave me a moment to think. Standard, I would think. I can identify viruses with the use of a microscope, or sense them if I know which one I'm looking for. Think of it like call mineral, but searching for a virus isn't as easy as for gold. Why? He stood up and grabbed a folder from the desk.
This isn't a case yet, but it might be. The CDC notified me that they thought there might be either a weapons lab or someone who has some of the missing samples.
Samples? I asked, my brow arching. Even if it was something innocuous like the common cold, it could be deadly. He gave a bitter smile.
Were you aware that since 1972, at least 30 samples of various diseases have disappeared from storage? They figure most of them were just put away in the wrong place, but not all. Getting samples of other diseases like Ebola or Volpox or even SARS isn't that hard.
I set my coffee down, blinking. Really? I had to resist the urge to cover my stomach, where that tiny life or lives might be growing or dying even now. And this is normal? He shrugged.
That was my question. They said most of the epidemiological community knew about it, but there wasn't a reason to make it public. It would just scare people.
Yeah, because it scares me. I pulled out my phone and started to pull up the shapes and structures of these viruses, and I'd need to practice in the lab on how to identify and break them. Breaking a virus didn't work the same way as breaking a molecule structure.
So that is why I asked for you.
I lifted my head from the website I was on and looked at him. No, I have no clue why you asked for me.
You are strong enough to go in and find the source. You received the smallpox vaccine as part of your medical tests prior to the draft. You also have him.
Stephen jerked his thumb at Caroline.
I don't believe he is susceptible to most Earth diseases, has a much better nose than any of us, and can react as needed. Anyone else I'd send in would be a huge team, and the person would have time to shut down, destroy the lab, or go full mad scientist. The odds are, you can arrive as a visitor and just not create much notice.
I gave Stephen an incredulous look. Did you miss the calf that is almost my weight and bright red? He started to laugh. Caroline ignored both of us, still pretending to sleep.
I grant you that, but it means you are so obvious no one is going to expect that you are investigating anything. I can't force you because we don't have a valid case yet. 5 weird infections with 1 death aren't enough to start a true investigation. But I know Naomi, and she trusts me. Your department has a lot of leeway, and frankly, you're one of the most level-headed people I know. Your skills just make you even more perfect for the job.
Part of me lit up with excitement. Another part, a new part, thought about the life growing inside me. Stop it. Women get pregnant every day. They don't go into confinement. I'll be fine. When would I need to leave?
I was hoping by Saturday. You'll need to fly out and get a place to stay that can act as your home base for a while. It won't make sense to people if you don't stay anywhere.
He handed me the folder with a shrug.
People get snippy.
I gave a grunt of acknowledgement as I opened the folder. It had the notes from a local doctor and some geographical information. This isn't much, I pointed out. And where is this?
You're right, it isn't much. It's a small town in Nebraska. The county coroner is the one who reported it, but it's a bit more complicated. I think there is something going on, and these are just the slip-ups, not the actual attack. I would prefer to stop it before there is an actual attack.
I shot him a glance from under my lashes. The frown and darkness in his eyes were heavier than normal. He's really worried. If Naomi doesn't care and I'm not paying for our flights, sure.
No, I'll be paying for everything out of a discretionary budget. I'm hoping you find nothing, just a weird coincidence. Otherwise, I'll deal when you let me know what is there.
I nodded and closed the folder. I'll have to take the time to sit and really read this. There's a lot of information here. but I'd rather do it back in the office. Stephen sighed.
That makes sense. I'll wait. Maybe it is nothing but random chance. It can happen, but right now the CDC is facing major budget shortages, and until an investigation is declared, they won't step in. But your office can act in absentia for them, so I'm hoping with your skill set, it will be enough to prevent a major issue.
I nodded at that. We worked with the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, often. We had people experienced with dangerous situations and could react to sealed-down areas if needed. The CDC tended more towards lab nerds than people like me. Naomi had ensured I was sent through basic weapons and law enforcement training, making sure I would only shoot what I wanted to shoot, though I only carried my weapon if on a specific job. With Caroline and my mage abilities, a gun didn't make me more lethal. Trust me, I find anything actively going on like a new disease breeding ground or worse, a bunch of animals that are spreading a disease, I'll be locking it down and calling the CDC. I'm good at chasing small things to find clue, not managing a major outbreak. Stephen nodded, his eyes not lightening up.
I know. I'm really hoping it's a rare animal that got infected. There is still the occasional rodent that carries the Black Plague in the Southwest, so that isn't impossible.
He rubbed his face with his hands, just adding to his exhaustion.
Of course, then there is Caroline.
At that, Caroline lifted his head to look at the two of us.
What about me? I do not carry diseases.
He sounded affronted at the very idea.
No, I know that. But do you know if you are susceptible to any of them? Can they mutate and infect other denizens?
Most of my friends had taken up my name for the beings from the various realms. It sounded better than calling them creatures. Caroline yawned, but I sensed it was mostly for show than a real yawn.
I am unsure. I shall ask, but I must point out that I have never heard of it.
True, but how many familiars are there, and how often do they stay in contact with other denizens?
Stephen had his body shifted towards Caroline, paying close attention.
Not many. Familiars require a very unusual set of desires. We are usually very young or very old. I am an example of the young being but a kid when I chose. Ericina is the other extreme. She was hatched when your country was being founded. I have asked, but do not expect an answer fast. The realms are not as consistent as your world, and many familiars may only be known to magic.
He rolled over in a stretch that had his tail touching one wall and his front paws the other. Then he sprawled out on his back, eyes closed. How many familiars are recorded by the OMO? The Office of Magical Oversight had records on the majority of mages in the world. While not required to report familiars, only because of their rarity, most mages had it noted in their files. I could go look it up, but I had no doubt Stephen already knew the answer.
Worldwide? About 462,000. As far as we know, it is about 1 out of 5,000 mages who have one.
I tilted my head, thinking about it. That was barely any compared to the mage population, much less the human population. But still, it was more than I expected. At this point, I'd met easily 300 mages in my life, and 5 had familiars, including myself. Though it was 6 if I included James. His familiar, the Phoenix Georgaz, was still around, but an independent entity. I flicked my hands away. That is a problem for another time. Though I doubt they are susceptible to earth diseases, and for the most part, they've never talked about sickness in their realms. It has always been poisons or venoms. I'll assume not unless he gets information otherwise. It looked like Stephen was going to argue, then his shoulders sagged.
Thank you. Let me know.
Anything else? I asked, still watching him. Something didn't seem right.
No, I'll file the request. Naomi will approve it as a fact-finding mission. Let's hope I'm becoming paranoid in my old age.
Please. You're what, 40? That isn't old. He laughed.
Thank you, I think. But I'm 48, or almost. Remember, I've already done my draft, then worked for the FBI for another 20. A few more years and I'll be able to retire.
Something I couldn't catch flickered across his face.
Either way, this was a good excuse to see you. Please remember to leave the gate before you teleport back,
he said with a smile in his voice, even if his face was stoic. Lesson learned, but I will see if I can find a good location to teleport to. I get the feeling this won't be my last trip here.
Probably not.
He rose, and when I did also, he pulled me into a hug. I returned it with interest. Why don't you and Indira come for a long weekend? Next month? I figured by then we might be ready to start sharing the information about the pregnancy, at least to close friends.
I'd like that. I'll check with Indira.
We talked for another few minutes, settling on a date in late October. One more hug, and he escorted me out of the building. I walked to the gate, then a bit further, looking for a suitable location outside of the gates to memorize as a good sidestepping spot. It took me a few minutes. Man-made structures were better than plants. Those tended to change too much. Finally, I found one, shaded from view, and I memorized it before stepping home. Chapter 9. The Bureau of Indian Affairs still sends out mages to try and communicate with the American Indian nation. The only known portal has a door that looks like it was taken from a castle. There is a bell on it, but up to this point no official has gotten anyone to open the door. The wall separating the AIN from the rest of the world is still impossible to breach. OMO, Internal Memo. I hit the office first thing the next morning. The file needed to be revised, travel requests needed to be made, and I wanted to think about what I was walking into. Naomi swung by my desk as I was trying to find a hotel to stay at. There weren't many options, and if this was supposed to be subtle, a rental might be better. That meant more paperwork. You meet with the FBI yesterday? I nodded, looking up from the numbers on diseases listed in the report. Yes, I'm going to head out Saturday, but I need to get a booster shot for some of the diseases the coroner reported. I didn't realize smallpox was still an issue. Smallpox? Naomi arched an eyebrow, tilting her head a bit. Interesting. It is considered an extinct disease, but it does crop up very occasionally. Go ahead, get the full booster today. You'll need tomorrow to recover. Some of those shots pack a wallop. I sighed, but sent a note making an appointment for right after lunch. I'll keep you updated, but for now I'm just digging into the file. I didn't mention I had an appointment in 2 weeks. We were waiting for that long before my first obstetrician appointment. A doctor Joe and Sable promised I would like. Naomi pursed her lips, then nodded. Working with the FBI is always questionable, but if you think he's trustworthy, he is. It's probably nothing, but I'll bring the gear I need in case it is something. Permission to requisition that gear? I meant a full hazmat suit. In theory, I could create a vacuum around me with air, but why trust my abilities when I could be doubly safe with a suit and only use my magic if needed, or as extra protection? Ugh, yes. But if you don't use it, please check it back in. Those things are expensive. Will do. I typed as I spoke, entering in more forms. Naomi waved and headed to her office while I continued to dig into the report. My contact there would be a coroner by the name of Adam Walsh. Caroline grumbled in his sleep, rolled over, thudding into the desk, and went back to snoring softly. I went back to reading the file Stephen had given me. Adam Walsh had been called in to consult on 3 cases at the local hospital. It had a whole 50 beds in it. He'd been surprised to see a pox that wasn't chickenpox. and he'd only recognized it because he'd been a military doctor back in his 30s. They had better infectious disease symposiums. He actually noted this. The victim was isolated and treated with antivirals, and they made a full recovery. He had sent samples to the CDC of the 3 victims, but they were backed up for months on running samples. The 4th victim died. The notes weren't clear, but if I interpreted them correctly, the 4th victim was found already dead and only came into town occasionally. So there was no reason to believe he had spread it, though it was always possible. The bottom line of the report, with the autopsy notes, was that he thought they were 3 different poxes, but without a microscope that could see the virus shape and a catalog to compare them to, he couldn't be sure which ones they were. But his gut told him the old man died from smallpox. I sat there staring at the file. Smallpox was taught as the scary civilization ender, but it hadn't been seen widely since magic rippled across the world. Magic helped to create the vaccines for it, and many others. So why would it be in Nebraska, of all places? I didn't find any CDC labs near Genoa, but that didn't mean there weren't smaller labs, and remote locations were better for some research. It could be nothing, or it could be a ticking time bomb. I filled out the requisitions for a suit and sample collection cases. Then I headed down to get my shots. I walked in and bared my arm for the shots. "Are you pregnant?" the tech asked. My body froze, as did my mind. "Maybe. Does it matter?" I managed to stammer out the question. The tech paused. "Let me check." She reread some notes. "No. If you were in your last trimester, we would advise you to wait, but they are safe, though you need to wait for 15 minutes to make sure you don't have any reactions." I let a sigh of relief out as she jabbed me in both arms. Anthrax and smallpox. I was up to date on the more common ones, and I already had my flu shot for the year. Dutifully, I sat there the 15 minutes, setting up plane flights for Saturday afternoon out of ATL. It was just easier as we still had the apartment to leave from that airport, as opposed to JFK. The tech decided I hadn't died and let me go, with both arms already aching. I left, stopped at the apartment to do a quick clean, then, even though it was early, I headed back to the house. I needed to pack, let Joe and Sable know I was headed out, and work on that blanket. Knitting was annoying, but maybe I was getting better. I stepped into the house and into the middle of an argument. "I say the nursery needs to be near Cori's room. She'll need to nurse the baby for at least 6 months. Sable was glaring at Joe, her arms wrapped around her stomach and lower lip out. "And then what? Are you going to go upstairs every time the baby cries? How would you even hear it? We can get bottles and bottle feed at night. Cori will probably be more than glad to not have to get up in the middle of the night." Joe glared back. Off to the side, watching both of them, was Hamadia with an odd expression on her face. "I don't need to guess as to the argument?" I said mildly, hefting my bag on my shoulder. "Cori!" They both spun on me, relief and vindication clear on their faces. "Tell her!" they said in unison, pointing at each other. "I'm right. It should be upstairs." Sable waved above her head where my bedroom would be. "Downstairs!" Joe jabbed at their bedroom. I held up my hand. "First, we have 9 months, if I'm actually pregnant. Which is why we have to decide now, before we need the nursery." Joe groaned. "If we wait, the kid will be sleeping in a cradle in our rooms for most of its life." "And what exactly is wrong with that? That was how Dad raised me." Sable had a dangerous, almost mutinous look on her face, and I sensed an explosion coming. The need to interject rose off of Hamadia like steam in the morning, but she waited as both women had fiery tempers when they got riled up. "So, have you thought about talking to or listening to the dryad that is all but bouncing over there?" I spoke loud enough that my voice acted like a gong in the tense room. "Who? Why? You can help us settle this, Joe said, focusing on me. Oh no, not a chance. Again, ask the dryad. I had an inkling that she had a solution after I'd seen my closet and her joy at the idea of a child. What? Sable turned to look at Hamadia. Oh, I'm so sorry. Joe and I were so busy that we didn't really notice you. I am sorry. What did you want to tell us? Joe blushed and rubbed her face. I had no doubt that if they had been alone, the fight would have culminated with them in bed, then talking it out and coming to a compromise. Both of them were all fire and fury, little actual anger. I'd accused them once of this being their foreplay, silly arguments that they ended up in bed over. They'd changed the topic. I show? Hamadia asked, green leaves sprouting out on her face like a line of feathers. I know you have started making the baby. New life is always good. So I made a room? Her leaves turned red-orange as her eyes darted between the three of us. Joe opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, Sable slapped her hand over Joe's mouth. I would love that, Hamadia, Sable said with a big grin. Please, show us. She pulled her hand away with a muttered ouch. Biting is unfair. Joe grinned at her, then gave a soft bow to Hamadia, her body relaxing. Lead on, Hamadia. You know we love your home. The leaves along her cheeks brightened back to green and sprouted down her arms. She did her toe float walk, which made me wonder once again how much of her was here versus still in the realm, and headed into Joe and Sable's room. They'd grabbed the room on the first floor, mainly because of the huge walk-in shower. It was a decent-sized bedroom, but I liked the view from my second floor, plus the little balcony near the study. Last time I'd paid attention to the room, it had an armoire, then the bathroom with the walk-in shower. The room seemed a bit smaller, and I realized a closet had been created along the wall that had previously supported the armoire. Oh, that's nice. You did that? I asked Hamadia. The three of us. Turns out if we buy the drywall, she can pull it into her and build. It's kind of nice. Joe had a funny smile on her face, and I rolled my eyes. You mean you were worried you wouldn't have any space to put all your clothes? I retorted with Sable nodding up and down behind Joe. Hey, I just have good taste and a body to display it, she replied with a mock pout. She turned and frowned. But that's new. There's 2 doors. Where before there had been 1 door to the bathroom, now there were 2. Chapter 10. Enterprising pregnant mages can leverage the increased urination need as offering. If they are skilled at tapping different body parts, they can utilize the urine in their bladder. No one is sure why it works better for pregnant women than none. The Pregnant Mage. This morning, the door had been roughly in the center of the wall. Now it was 4 feet from the center, with the other door barely a foot from the hallway wall. Sable pursed her lips as she shot a confused look at Hamadia. Still frowning, Sable opened the door near the outer wall. It opened to reveal the same bathroom that had always been there, though the door was now closer to the sinks. We all looked at Hamadia, who bounced up and down on her toes like a giddy child. Sable's smile as Hamadia's joy spread through the house like a wave of bubbles was unmistakable. She stepped over and opened the other door. It swung open to a room done in tones of spring green, about 8 feet by 10 feet. She stepped in, and Joe and I followed. Our curiosity was so strong I could taste it. Inside the room, the ceiling provided the illusion that you were looking up into the sky from a clearing in the forest. The brown trunks of trees sprouted up from the corners of the room. The 3 doors in the room were created from solid wood and adorned with carvings of nymphs, dryads, and other forest creatures. The baseboards looked like roots about to burst into the room. The room would have been at home in a fairy tale. A cradle in gleaming, honey-toned wood rocked in one corner. The wall without doors housed a long dresser with a built-in changing table. On the side near the bathroom, there was a door, and another one on the wall across from us. Logically, that door should have led into the hall powder room. An inkling of what I would find led me over to the door. I pulled the door open and stepped into my bedroom with a soft laugh. How? What? That is impossible, Jo protested. She stood in the middle of the room, looking at our bedroom through the open door we'd come through, and me standing in my room. Magic house, remember? I teased. I turned to Hamadia, and with true sincerity spoke. Hamadia, this is wonderful. It is exactly what we needed, and you did an incredible job decorating it. Little flowers burst out in her hair, peeking out around her leaves as if shy. How or where are the lads? Sable stood next to the wall where a switch sat. It was one of the slider ones that I didn't think were anyplace else in the house. Her finger ran down the slider, and the room slowly dimmed, going from high noon to late summer sun to dusk to midnight with a full moon to the dark of the moon. As we stood there, eyes flicked open in the trees. They watched us, but it made you feel safe, protected, as an owl hooted. This is incredible. Sable's voice was hushed as she moved the light back up to noon.
It is the light in most of the realms. We have a sun, but not as you think. It is pure magic, and lights the realms going through a cycle similar to your sun.
Hamadia spun in a circle, leaves dropping from her.
But I'm so glad you like it.
I gave a wide-eyed look to Jo and Sable, who both sported dumbfounded looks on their faces. It was Jo who spoke first. Like? Hamadia, this is incredible. Doesn't begin to express it. I hoped for a room a bit bigger than a closet. This is glorious. Jo waved her hand to encompass everything. How can we thank you? Because we never expected anything this amazing. Hamadia spun in a circle, then paused.
Can I get some more nitrogen?
She meant for her roots, which were intertwined into the foundation of the house in the basement. Her branches weaved through everything and formed the structure of house. Hamadia, you ever need anything like that? You just ask. No favors. It is your food. You tell us what you need. I said these words very firmly, catching her glance. Just like I would get Caroline food or medicine, we will always get you what you need. Her body sprouted tiny red flowers up and down her arms and legs. Okay. She spun once more and disappeared. That definitely resolved the argument, though not the way I expected. Sable murmured, moving over to Jo's side. Jo instantly wrapped her arms around Sable, pulling her close. Get over here, Cori. You deserve this hug too, Jo ordered. I moved over, and Jo pulled me into the hug. The three of us stood there looking at the wonder that was the nursery. A baby. We're going to have a baby. There was a muffled squee from the two of them. I just smiled. It didn't feel real yet. We have an appointment in 6 weeks. Even if we know you are pregnant, that doesn't mean you still will be. Sable shot me an urgent glance. You will tell us if you bleed or miscarry, right? I hugged them both tighter. The second I start to cramp, but I'm going to remain positive. This will work out. You will have a child I get to spoil royally and hand back to you. Tears might have glimmered in eyes, but if they were there, we didn't mention it. I luxuriated in the hug for another minute, then pulled back. Where's Caroline?
The kit of my litter is in the tree.
Esmir spoke in my mind, and she sounded exasperated. What? Joe turned to glance at Esmir. We'd all given up being surprised when she appeared.
Up.
Her emerald green fur looked so right in the soft green room, you might have thought it had been made to highlight her beauty. She tilted her head up, and I followed her gaze. There, up in what I had thought were painted-on branches, sat Caroline. His tail waved back and forth as his eyes tracked motion in the trees. Caroline, I swear to the gods, if you ever drop down from there and scare me or the baby, I will have a new fur rug for the nursery. The snarl in Sable's voice was impressive.
I like her, and I'd help. You should know that disturbing mothers, especially new ones, is unwise.
Esmir had sat down, tail drifting back and forth.
I would not do that.
He had a note of offense in his voice as he crossed down the branch, and as I watched, it went from real to two-dimensional. It made me want to ask Hamadia what else she could do. Maybe I can see the stars at night. I pushed the thought away. There were other things to pay attention to right now. Esmir, she turned to look at me, even as Caroline lay on the floor, sulking and ignoring all of us. Are you here to talk about the disease question?
Yes,
she said simply as she looked around the room.
Hamadia did an excellent job creating a micro-realm here. Did she point out you could use it as a fortress room?
Micro-realm? Joe asked while Sable burst out with, Fortress room?
Esmir shook her head. If I know that dryad, she didn't mention anything practical. Just showed off the pretty stuff like the lights and the trees.
No, she didn't. Would you? Sable stood in front of Esmir, who, sitting up with her tail wrapped around her, had her head at the same level as Sable.
This is a realm, keyed to you and this house. If you came in here and shut the doors, no one could open them besides you. It would defeat anyone except maybe Tersane, Bob, or Salistra.
Those were the names of the demigods for spirit, chaos, and order. None of them were beings you wanted to upset.
It is a wonderful gift, and as the years go by, will be very useful. She could even make it so only you could see this room. No intruder could ever find it.
Sable and Joe looked around again, and I could almost feel them thinking. Stop it, both of you, I ordered. Worry about other things down the road, and you know you will always have a home here. Joe shrugged. I was just wondering if we do decide to move to the Tudor house, if there was a dryad that might want to live with us. Esmir bristled, and I cringed. I would be very careful about how you asked that. Apparently, James trapped her here. It wasn't anything she chose. My voice was soft. This was more information I'd found out via his journals.
Yes, it upset her greatly. But she likes you.
A low grumble came out of Esmir. Not a purr, yet not a growl.
I will say, if I find a damaged dryad who'd like to live on Earth, I will offer, stressing that you would cherish and protect her. That might be the tipping point. Many of the dryads live in fear of their tree being chopped down. Houses are much better protected.
Jo had a stricken look on her face, while Sable looked around frowning. Should we set her free? I never thought about it. Jo came over and wrapped an arm around Sable's shoulders as they both watched Esmir.
No, she is the house. The only way to free her is to destroy her. She is happier now than I suspect she has been in centuries. You bring life, laughter, and love where you go.
For a moment, I thought she was going to say something more about that, but instead she tilted her head to face me.
The answer to you, Cori, is no. At least, mostly no.
Joe and Sable had been whispering to each other, but the look on their faces told me they decided to not follow up on the comments. "And the question is?" Sable asked instead as she walked around the room, her hand invisibly measuring things. I shrugged, trying to downplay everything. Trying to figure out if human or earth diseases can affect Caroline, or really any realm denizen. I shifted my attention back to Esmir, who sat picture perfect. When she started to pose, it worried me. She rarely cared enough to pose. "What did you mean, mostly no?" She shifted her amber eyes over to me, and I swear her whiskers twitched with amusement. But it was gone so fast I couldn't prove anything. "Your viruses will not harm us, so the diseases that rack your world find us unfathomable. However, your fungi and spores do not care about their hosts. They can cause issues, but only if we are very lax in monitoring our bodies." "And bacteria?" Her head tilted and her tail twitched. It must have meant more than I thought because Caroline rose up to come over and rub his face against hers.
"That is more questionable. Some will, most will not. Our internal digestive systems are less conducive to your bacteria, but that is not to say that they are unable to hurt us. Overall, it is deemed unlikely. Our inherent magic tends to destroy their small life forms." Her tail flicked. "There is nothing else. Now." She paused and sniffed me. "I thought you were pregnant. You do not smell pregnant." Joe and Sable froze like two deer caught in the path of an oncoming meteor. I just shrugged. That doesn't really surprise me. I was only implanted yesterday. Even with the drugs, I don't think my body is caught up with what is going on yet. I kept my tone light and amused, even if I was trying to fight down panic that maybe this was over before it even began. "Ah, yes. Normally after a few days the body starts to change, but not yet. I shall be back tomorrow."
"Sure, but I'm leaving Friday night, so if you want to sniff me, you'll need to find Caroline first."
"Where are you going?"
Joe asked as she and Sable unwound a little. "You know, if you two are going to be this jumpy, having a kid is going to make you both have heart attacks," I teased.
"And you are deflecting?"
Joe countered. "Yep, because I'm headed out to Nebraska for work. It's that thing I do." They looked at each other. Then Sable opened her mouth. I cut her off. "No, I still have a job, you know that. With the draft, I can't even skip out or take a sabbatical. I will be careful. Caroline will be with me, and I can always sidestep home if I need to. Take deep breaths and let it go." Again, that silent conversation. Then Joe nodded.
"Point. But, Cori, you be careful. We can't live with losing you."
You will not lose her. I will always be there to guard her and the child."
Caroline huffed as he walked around me, his tail wrapping around me like a furry lasso.
"Bah, you all worry too much. She is the herald. She will be fine and bear strong children."
With that comment, Esmir turned and slipped back out the way she had come, and we went to make dinner. Chapter 11. Pregnancy fact. The sensitivity of the nose sharply increasing is one of the first signs that you might be pregnant. Previously mild odors can register as strong and unappealing. The reverse can happen also. Smells may be all but invisible to a pregnant woman. The pregnant mage. Joe and Sable gave me tight hugs on Friday, well before I sidestepped to the apartment, then headed to the airport. I hugged them back, assured them they were worrying over nothing, and headed to Genoa, Nebraska. The flight was exactly as I expected. Long, boring, and claustrophobic. The government didn't pay for business class, though at least I was reimbursed for checking my bags. With the hazmat suit and the sample kit, there was no way to travel with only a carry-on. I spent the flight reading up on pregnancy and wondering when my scent would change. The warm, fuzzy feeling at the idea of being pregnant made me roll my eyes at myself. I didn't know if I wanted or didn't want maternal feelings. Either way, I'd find out. There was no major airport at Genoa or Columbus, so I was forced to land in Omaha and rent a car. I still didn't like driving. If I had my way, I'd sidestep everywhere or drive a rig. Driving the ambulance never made me nervous. Maybe because of the 2 tons of steel around me. I got the car, a sedan that seemed way too small to offer reliable protection, and put my bags in the trunk. I'd specified I needed a car with a GPS system. I loaded up the location of the rental I'd be staying in, checking the travel time. The only accommodation I'd been able to find was a vacation rental that slept 16. It meant I'd rattle around in the house, but better that than an hour-plus drive back and forth to Columbus. I headed out, relaxing once I was on the highway. At a gas station that was both well-lit and empty, I let Caroline know where I was. A momentary flash of pain as the rip opened, and he was there.
I do not like you being away from me for so long, where there is no access to you.
His grousing warmed my heart as I petted him. It wasn't that bad, and you know you don't like flights. This is easy enough. His ears were back as he jumped into the car, careful not to extend his claws. He had shredded the leather in my first rental car. I was not happy about paying for those damages, and let him know. Plus, I'd made him apologize. He hated apologizing. Since then, he'd been much more careful.
You might have needed me,
he muttered, letting me buckle the seatbelt into his harness. It freaked people out to see him sitting in the car as we drove down the road, but it made me feel better to have him buckled in, even if he'd never let himself be caught in an accident. And if I did, were you going to step into an airplane in the sky? We've talked about this. He didn't look at me, but his tail lashed. I let him be. He was always like this when he couldn't easily reach me, and airplanes were difficult. Not only couldn't he accurately sense me, he couldn't come if I called. The drive was endless. Nebraska is nothing but land and the occasional farmhouse. I think I saw more animals than people as I drove into town. The rental had mentioned getting groceries, and I wanted to find a safe local place to sidestep to before I started on my investigation. I pulled into the local grocery store, a small one called Ray Valley Market. I gave Caroline a hard look. You going to behave yourself and act cuddly, or should I just leave you in here? He'd finally chilled out an hour into the drive.
I want to stretch,
he admitted. I clicked the leash to his collar. It was totally for show, but until I had a chance to know people, I wasn't going to freak them out more than necessary. Looping the leash around my arm implied control. Most days, he thought it meant he could control me. I laughed to myself. The vagaries of having a familiar. Maybe it was like having a child and a husband all wrapped into one. That thought caught me, and I paused, looking at him stretching out, the familiar ass and tail in the air as those long limbs stretched in a way the human body could never hope to. You know I love you, right? And that I couldn't imagine my life without you? He froze mid-stretch, glancing over his shoulder at me.
Of course you do. I am beyond par. I chose you and will always know I made the best selection in my queen. She was just smart enough to acknowledge the wisdom of my choosing and choose 2 other incredible queens.
He finished his stretch and rubbed his face across my hip. You just like making me smell like you, I teased, knowing it was the only way he could respond to my emotion-laden statement. Most denizens seemed to be more than a bit bewildered by the facets of human emotions. It was okay. I knew he'd kill for me, and what more could anyone ask for?
Of course. Everyone should know you are mine.
That statement coming from a human would worry me greatly.
You wear a ring symbolizing possession. Why do you not want others to know you are cherished?
I didn't answer. There was a world of discussion there I wasn't going to get into in the parking lot of a small-town grocery store. We headed through the sliding glass doors into the store, and I grabbed a cart. One of the employees near the door froze as we walked through, mouth open and eyes wide. I headed to the vegetables and produce, trying to grab a few things so I didn't have to eat out constantly. When I turned around, some apples and salad in my cart, there were 5 people watching us, all with looks of fascinated terror. "Hi," I said to them with a small smile and headed to the meat section.
"Salmon,"
Caroline said, and I glanced at him. There were still people following us at a distance, so I opted to mind speak instead of out loud. No reason to really freak people out. This is about as far from the ocean as we can get in this country. Beef or pork or chicken, because I'm not paying those prices. He heaved a sigh that would have made me think I told him he would be eating salad for a week.
Fine. Chicken or beef?
I grabbed 2 meals worth of beef and chicken. Then I finished up the shopping. The cart was full with various items, and I smiled as I approached the checkout. I got to expense all of this. Feeding Caroline was expensive. Ma'am? The checkout person stammered as I put things on the conveyor. "Is that your pet?" His voice squeaked on the word pet. "No, it's my familiar." I tapped my temple, pointing to my Merlin tattoo. "Oh," he said, his eyes locked on Caroline, who played it up, sitting up and yawning. Around us, people were staring, and even the music overhead had been cut off. I ignored them all and let the man scan my groceries as I bagged. I'd paid with the agency card and was wheeling my purchases to the car when the first cop showed up. So much for a low profile. They didn't have lights or sirens on, but the car jerked to a hard stop as I stepped out. My gun was in the car, and I wasn't going to do anything to make them more freaked out than they were. I rolled my eyes, then scratched Caroline's ears. "You are more trouble than you're worth occasionally. Don't be a jerk and scare them. This is a work assignment. Be professional."
"You're no fun. I bet I could have gotten them to pee in terror,"
he said in a mock whine. "And shoot you? Only if you want to deal with the wound," I countered, popping open the trunk and loading the food, the leash still looped around my hand. The sound of another vehicle approaching, then the opening of car doors, had me turning as I shut the trunk. The food would be fine until I got to the rental. It had been a while since I'd been in the more rural parts of America, and the few times I had, it was with a government group, and Caroline had his official harness on that made people assume he was the equivalent of a K-9 or something like that. Now, he had on a basic harness that didn't do anything besides look pretty. If I yanked on the leash, it would snap, and was meant to. But it also meant he looked like an exotic pet, which most jurisdictions frowned on, if only they knew how exotic. 2 police cars were in the lot behind me, each with a uniformed person standing next to the door, hands on their guns, but not drawn, which was a bonus. "Hello, officers," I said, my voice calm as I leaned against the trunk of the car.
"Is this your animal, ma'am?"
the officer asked, his voice wary. He was older, about 50, with a receding hairline that made his forehead seem huge. He didn't have the belly I expected, but instead a body that looked like it could use a bit more exercise and fewer pot roasts. The other officer surprised me for some reason. A woman, my height, but with long, straight black hair that hit her waist in a mass of braids. She had the tiny frame the Japanese side of Sable's family had. A glint of color at her temple reinforced the fact she was a mage, though too far away for me to tell what type. "Not exactly. This is Caroline, my familiar." I waved my hand at Caroline, who, to my relief, was acting like a good guard animal. Even in my thoughts, I was smart enough to not think of him as a dog. A tiny bit of tension bled out of them, though hands did not drop away from their guns. "You passing through?" This was the female police officer. "Staying here for a while, taking a break from the hectic life, you know." I tried to be light and amused, but their wariness worried me. Slowly, they came closer, and I sucked in a breath at how breathtakingly beautiful the female officer was. Her eyes were green, and she had beautiful skin and a heart-shaped face. They both had their eyes locked on Caroline. "That thing going to be out and about without a leash?" the man asked, his voice one that I used to hear from Stephen Alexin all the time, the cop voice.
"I am not a thing. I am Caroline, and a leash would not stop me from anything I wanted to do."
Caroline replied, his voice icy. I wanted to facepalm as both officers paled and took a step back. "He also has an attitude." I smiled as I said that. I'd strangle him later. The woman glanced at the man, and he nodded once.
"Have a good day, ma'am. Sergeant, call me if you need me."
He gave one more long, searching look at Caroline and me, then turned and headed back to his vehicle. A minute later, the car was pulling out. The woman's hand had fallen off her gun as she walked over to me. "You must be Cori Munroe?" I arched a brow at her. Was there a bolo put out on me? The police life had sunk into me more than I realized when I was using police acronyms for "be on the lookout for." She smiled and her face lit up. "No, but my husband is a Merlin and gets the House of Amherst monthly newsletter. You're talked about. The cat is rather hard to miss." She nodded at Caroline.
"I am a cat, not a cat. Like I would deign to be a pampered house cat."
Somehow he managed to sound affronted and snooty at the same time. The sergeant's mouth twitched. "Sergeant Amy Johansson." She held out a card, and I took it. "We got calls about a lady with a scary lion as a pet." Her eyes traced over Caroline. "Well, I've never yet seen a red lion. The size isn't that far off." Trust me, when he decides he wants lap time, you'd think he'd weighed as much as one. I replied as I slipped the card into my wallet. She laughed, and I blinked again, my own preconceptions being shattered again. I wasn't expecting friendly amusement. Oh well, Stephen had asked for low profile, not no profile. I was wondering, I'm supposed to meet with the town coroner. Any chance you could point out his office? Her face slipped into a beautiful mask, and all of me went tense. "Ah, so that's why you're here. I think you and the captain should talk." Chapter 12. The incident at the SEC game in Atlanta is still a topic of discussion for magical historians and researchers. While Agents Alexant and his team have all been interviewed, it has been determined that they were under the effects of some localized magic that distorted their perception of events. It is ludicrous to think that a unicorn and an unidentified blob could have a rational conversation. The Gorgon might have low-level human intelligence, but mostly they are powerful monsters that mimic human expectations well. Portal Incident Reporting. She followed me back to the house I'd rented, or more accurately, I followed her after I took 2 wrong turns. The directions and the reality of the location did not match up. She even helped me get the groceries in, and Caroline got a stretch in. Then I followed her to the police station. Police station might have been a misnomer. It was a small suite of offices in the city offices building. No jail, no tough sergeant manning the counter, just 2 officers talking over something on a computer and 2 private offices. I told him you were coming. Second office. She meant that literally. The offices had Office 1 and Office 2 stenciled on them. The 2 officers had fallen silent as we entered, and upon seeing Caroline, their hands drifted to their guns. I really couldn't blame them, regardless of how much it annoyed me. I mean, Who in their right mind was calm when faced with a 150-pound cat with a long tail and eyes that saw way too much? I gave a nod and a smile as I moved to the door indicated. Caroleon stayed behind me, his silent paw steps betrayed only by his low, warning rumble. I could say something, but that would dismiss both the officer's valid reactions and Caroleon's, so I just knocked on the door.
"It's open,"
a man called out. I turned the knob and stepped in. Caroleon brushed by me. I swept my gaze over the room, taking in bland beige walls, industrial-style desk, and a man with sharp blue eyes and black hair staring back at me. The blue eyes didn't surprise me. The copper-hued skin and hawk nose typical of the few American Indian images I'd seen did. The American Indian nation had pulled away from the United States back in the late 1800s. I don't think outside of the occasional picture I'd ever seen one. From what I knew, they rarely left their reservations. James Wells had made notes about the wall that let animals and weather through, but that no human could touch. He'd wanted to explore it more, but Georgas refused, saying, "They are protected by their own. Let them be." His blue eyes scanned me once, and he nodded.
"Cori Munroe, double Merlin. Familiar is a Cath. Highly intelligent and anti-establishment. Works decently in a team. Thinks outside the box."
His voice had the soft lilt of the Midwest, but his eyes reminded me of a raptor, hard and sharp. "Are you describing me or Caroleon with that?" I asked as I sat down in the only chair in the office. The door swung shut behind me. In a move that struck me as unusual, Caroleon sat next to me, watching the man behind the desk.
"The report was unclear. John Tallians, sheriff for Platte County."
My eyes narrowed as I looked at him. Not to be rude, but what is an AIN member doing out here? And this doesn't look much like a sheriff's office. He shrugged.
"Working. Staging point for the county. Main office is in Columbus. So why exactly are you here?"
Two could play at this game, though I wondered if he was a mage. There were no tattoos at his temple, but from what little I knew, the AIN didn't mark mages that way. I pushed that to the side. While interesting, it didn't have anything to do with my mission here. "I suspect you know, or you wouldn't have had one of your officers pull in a poor mage out on vacation."
"You must be desperate if you are vacationing in Nebraska, but I'm guessing it has something to do with what Lizzie Reardon found."
I shrugged. FBI asked me to follow up as a favor. One dead means probably nothing, but if it leads to a lot dead, better to figure that out sooner. His shoulder twitched as I watched, but other than that, I had no idea what he was thinking.
"In my experience, Lizzie doesn't overreact. But then, as you say, one death doesn't mean much. It's when there are lots who die that it is too late."
"That is why I'm here," I said, my voice mild, "to see if there is an issue before it's too late." He looked at me, then moved his gaze over to Caroleon, eyes narrowing.
"Yes, she knows who and what I am. Directed mind speak to bypass someone else is rude. It is the equivalent of speaking another language in front of them."
Caroleon's voice surprised me, and I glanced back at him. His ears were canted back, and eyes dilated as he stared at the sheriff. John pulled back as if shocked. I gave in and laughed softly. "I'm impressed you can mind speak, but don't expect Caroleon to be like other familiars." I tilted my head, my own curiosity aroused. "You are familiar with realm denizens?" His eyes flicked to me, and I had no idea what he was thinking behind those shuttered, dark orbs.
"Realm denizens. Interesting name."
He paused and gave me a sharp nod.
"You'll do. I hope you find absolutely nothing but a weird set of coincidences."
The sheriff scribbled something on a notepad on his desk.
"Here's the directions to where Doc Reardon's got a small lab. Don't expect much. We don't have all the fancy money out here."
I took the piece of paper he handed me and stood. Curiosity nagged, so I asked a very rude question. "Are you a mage?" He looked at me, face impassive.
"I'm Arapaho. I hope you find absolutely nothing that is cause for your concern."
I recognized a clear dismissal and turned. Caroline already standing by the door and headed out. The 3 officers out in the small area nodded at me, but their attention remained on Caroline. Idiots. I could kill them quicker than Caroline could. It never ceased to amaze me how much people downplayed the things mages could do. Even now, having been a practicing mage for almost a decade, most of the mages I knew only used their magic at work or when it was needed. Something else to think about, though I knew a lot of the answers. We got outside, the useless leash in my hand and the cold spring day blooming around us. Might as well go talk to the doc and see if there is any information for us to read. I didn't know if people were listening in, but from the curiosity of the sheriff's deputies, I'd be more surprised if they weren't. Caroline flicked his tail as we headed back to the car, all too aware of many sets of eyes on us. I got the feeling that by the time this case was over, I'd be very ready to get back to a more urban setting, where no one blinked an eye at Caroline. Or everyone had heard about him. Over the years, there had been various feature articles about him in the paper and news, and he even had his own social media page. Sable ran that, not me. She enjoyed posting his silly pictures, and Caroline was both proud of the number of followers and horrified at humans fawning. It really depended on the day. In some ways, Caroline, Tiang, and the Phoenix of France, whose name was Flora, were the most well-known of all the familiars. I brushed aside my rambling thoughts as I started up the car, after getting him in. The directions were straightforward, and the lab was only 10 minutes away. But a single building with the words Platte County Courthouse on it wasn't what I was expecting. Small town. Have to remember this isn't Atlanta or New York. I sighed and got ready to go through the whole rigmarole again. Maybe it was a good thing I didn't wear a weapon. If I had a gun, the temptation to use it might just be too much. We walked in, Caroline next to me, pretending to be a meek animal, at least in his words. The security guard looked up as we stepped in.
"Merlin Monroe?"
he asked before the door had even closed. I held back a sigh and nodded. "Yes, I'm here to see the coroner."
"Yes, ma'am. The sheriff sends his apologies. He'd called to make sure you and Caroline here were cleared, but Dr. Reardon had already left for the day. The sheriff said he didn't have your number to let you know. Reardon will be here tomorrow morning, about 9 a.m.
I glanced at my watch, and to my surprise, it was after 4. The day had taken longer than I realized. It registered that I was hungry and tired. "Thank you. I'll be back tomorrow." I turned and headed back out the door, waiting until we were both secured in the car. How does dinner sound?
Excellent. And you smell pregnant.
Chapter 13. The changes taking place in China are upsetting decade-long policies and traditional ways of dealing with that country. Empress Shishi has already turned her court upside down. Many traditions are being cast aside, and the impression that the Dragon of China is her primary advisor has many people worried. Is this a good change, or will the shift occurring in China signal global changes? Magic and politics. Caroline's comment ensured I wasn't surprised when Esmir popped in as I was pulling steaks out of the refrigerator.
"Ah, yes. Now you smell like you carry a child."
Her words drifted into my mind, and I turned around to find her peering into the small kitchen. "Hello, Esmir. Staying for dinner?" I held up the steaks. It had originally been enough for leftovers, But if she ate, it would just barely be enough. No, I found something tasty earlier, though I might remember this area to go hunting. I cringed. Please remember to hunt the wild animals, not the domesticated. All animals are wild at heart, no matter the circumstances of their current existence, she replied, looking around the house. You will live here? There was a touch of concern to her thoughts, and I shook my head. No, this is just for me to stay while on this case. Albany will be my home for many years. Her tail stopped lashing, and I could see her relax. That is good. This is not the proper place for a child, or you. Those who court the tribes pay close attention to these lands. It matters not. Deal with your human needs. I shall be back later to check on you. A human child. This shall be fun. She was gone before I could follow up on any of it. Caroline, what did she mean by the tribes? He answered, though he still lay on the deck. The tribes. That tells me nothing. What are they? I got the steaks ready to cook and found some vegetables to steam, something I was pretty sure I couldn't screw up.
The tribes. They are the tribes, like the sky is the sky.
Exasperation was in his tone, and I let it go. There were some questions that, without a specific frame of reference, it seemed like we were talking two different languages. To my relief, I didn't burn the steaks. Nothing happened that evening, and by 9 the next morning, I was pulling up to the county office buildings. I knew the county seat was in Columbus, but apparently they had extra offices to make trips not so long. I wasn't sure and got out. Sidestepping had spoiled me. In the last 2 days, I'd done more driving than I had in the last 3 months put together. With Caroline's leash in my hand, I went into the building. The same security guard as yesterday nodded at me. Ma'am, I told the doc you were coming. Doc said fine. If you turn to your left and go all the way down, the satellite morgue is at the very end, past the pressure doors. Thank you. I passed through the metal detector, then collected the accoutrements I'd removed to get through, and headed down the hallway. I only passed 3 people on the way there. 2 of them gasped and pressed against the wall, acting like a rogue lion was walking down the hall. The third, a woman with short spiked hair in red, purple, and blue, turned to look at us. I totally need to try the color of red. The hair colors always go to blue or orange. Marilyn Monroe, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Reardon, but call me Lizzie. There are days when I wonder if someone moves me about on a chessboard, throwing me into situations just to see how I react. Lizzie Reardon was about my height, with a chunkier, more muscled build, and eyes that told me she had an old soul. She couldn't have been older than 40, but if I found out she was 60, it wouldn't have surprised me. Her temple was empty of a tattoo, but then I might have been more surprised if she had been a mage. Cori, please, though I have to admit, I thought you were a man, and a lot older. She grinned at me. I do that on purpose. Dad was the coroner for about 5 counties here until, 6 years ago. Edward Reardon. I sign everything E. Reardon and make them guess. It amuses me. She angled her eyes back at Caroline, who stood there, bored with human small talk. I grinned at her mischief. This is Caroline, my familiar. Not what I expected when I forwarded my report to the FBI and the CDC. Come on. She pivoted and strode down the hall, moving fast. I increased my speed and kept up with her as she went through the double doors and then turned almost immediately into a small office. Take a seat. I'll show you what I've got. The patient is already being cremated, so nothing for you to see there. But I've got my samples. She flung herself into the chair behind the desk and began typing on the keyboard like she had a need to crush the keys. I settled into the one chair. Caroline stuck his head in and snorted.
I'll wait out here. If I try to squeeze in there, either my tail would get stepped on or something would get shredded because my claws caught it.
He was exaggerating, but only because he had exquisite control over where his claws ended up. But the office was that small. Lizzie's head jerked up and she narrowed brown eyes at Caroline, who stretched out across the doorway, acting like he'd already fallen asleep. I thought familiars didn't talk to other people. I also didn't realize they were that intelligent. I shrugged. He's the equivalent of a cat attitude-wise. However, he creates and follows his own rules. And yes, he is very intelligent. I didn't say anything about the others I knew. That wasn't something most people needed to know. In many ways, it was safer for most to think about them as animals. Huh. She gave Caroline a long, speculative look, then shook her head, focusing on her computer screen. I really don't have much more than what I sent to the CDC. Patient Miles Herman died of complications from cowpox, something I've never seen in a human before. Lived alone in a shack outside of Genoa. I interrupted. Isn't Genoa in a different county? I'd scanned the maps while on the plane here. Genoa was in Nantes, while Monroe and Columbus were in Platte. Yeah, but the coroner there is ready to retire. Doesn't like weird, so he tosses them over to me. Her face lit up with a quick grin, and I am more than happy to take those on. In exchange, he picks up any of the nursing home desks in the area. They all know him better anyhow. They don't resent him coming in while I'm still a young whippersnapper. The humor in her face made me snicker. Got it. So, cowpox? I mean, I did some research on the way here, but how likely is that to kill someone here? A viral or epidemiology expert, I wasn't. Maybe I could become one with time, but for now I knew the basics and what I could find to read up on. Not very. I had to go research it. The last death was to a fetus when the mother was infected, and that was 12 years ago. There are dairy farms here, but I checked with the Department of Agriculture, and they don't have any records of breakouts anywhere for more than 50 years. I leaned back, frowning. So you're saying it's odd? Odder than a flying pig! There were 3 people hospitalized between Monroe and Genoa, but nothing in Columbus or anywhere else. She hit a button on her computer, and something started to print outside the door. One had a mild case of mousepox, the other a case of chickenpox after being fully vaccinated, and the third, she snorted but kept talking, has exactly 3 infections. He freaked out, thinking it was shingles, but instead he had camelpox. I have no idea where any of them came from. The chickenpox is at least possible if you don't get vaccinated fast enough or get hit with a stronger strain. But the rest? I had to get the virus images uploaded to the CDC to figure out what they were. I sat back in my chair, thinking, how close to each other are these viruses? Lizzie sighed, running her fingers through her short hair, making it stand up even more. Well, smallpox, monkeypox, and cowpox are all orthopox viruses, and camelpox is closely related. So close, he barely had any symptoms, and as far as I can tell, he's the first human victim. It makes no sense. That's why you're here. I'm not an epidemiologist. I was hoping you would be. I laughed. Nope, I'm a drafty who goes to all the shitty jobs and tries not to screw up. She glanced at my temple, then at Caroline Lane in the door. Uh-huh. Well, that is all the information I have. Addresses of the infected people and the one who died. But what little worry I could get anyone to muster is fading, as it's been 4 weeks with no more infections. An epidemic doesn't go quiet like that. Without human intervention, I said softly. Exactly. Hence my worry. She stood, and I followed suit, mainly because she couldn't get out of her office if I didn't move first. Move, fuzzbutt. I'm not stepping over you. We've been down that path before. Caroline cracked open one eye, heaved a sigh, and rose, moving out of our way. Nice to know size doesn't change attitude. He's still a cat. In all ways. I took the sheaf of paper she handed me. Anyone going to get their nose out of joint if I go talk to people? Nah, John knows you're here. How much luck you'll have talking to people really depends on you. People around here can be super friendly or super closed off. Depends on the day and how you approach them. She shrugged. And they are still working on accepting me. That's where Caroline can help or hurt. Do you expect me to find a rogue mage in this lair? Lizzie snorted. Oh, I hope not. It never ends well for the plucky medical discoverer in those movies. They always die a horrible death, gasping out the final glue. What I expect is maybe a stash of samples that disappeared years ago that have decayed and maybe some animals are spreading them, or worst case, a newly emerged mage being a blasted idiot because they are 18 and immortal. Or this is just the weirdest coincidence ever and I'm crying wolf. The sheaf of papers in my hands felt very real and not like someone trying to get attention. Okay, I'll let you know. Thanks. It's me who should be thanking you. Be careful. Even mages still die from disease. Lizzie said, her voice serious. But I've got 2 accidents to autopsy to make sure they were from sheer stupidity and not murder. Newsflash, it was the 20 beers they had first. I left laughing, wondering exactly how the 2 dead bodies she had waiting for her had died. Caroleon followed in his low prowl, and the hallway was conspicuously empty as I left.
I like her.
Me too. Let's go see if we can figure out what's going on. I went to the hospital, but they couldn't give me any more information due to HIPAA issues. That left me investigating. I could have driven out to the dead patient's home immediately, but instead I swung by a gas station and bought 3 maps, one of the state, one of the surrounding cities, and one of Platte and Nance counties. Then I mapped out each of the addresses for the victims. Only the one who died had lived in Genoa, and that was barely. It was in a house as far from the little town as you could get, and still be part of Genoa. The others were scattered about. I checked, and on the surface, and per social media, the extent of anything they had in common was 2 had kids in high school. The locations didn't form a perfect circle or a pentagram or anything else scattered. One lived in Monroe, the others outside. It looked random, which it might be. I dressed in my hiking boots and cargo pants and had a windbreaker in the car, along with all my other supplies. Ready to go exploring? Chapter 14. Seductive, isn't it? The ability to change things with a thought, to whisper something in the wind and have it happen. Magic corrupts you from the inside out. Resist. The only way to truly be free is if we all turn away from this addiction. Say no before you succumb. Freedom from magic. There was still police tape on the door, but it had been broken since it was taped there. I looked the area over, but all I saw was a house that looked on its last legs. Caroleon, you stay out here and watch. I don't want to risk you coming in. He shot me a look, but stretched.
It is wise. There are much more interesting things to watch here. When this is done, I wish to go hiking and hunting. It has been boring of late.
That's only because you've been laying out back and being lazy, or bouncing back and forth between here and China. I pointed out as I stood on the porch, wincing at every creak of the wood. The house, made of logs and a dirty brown substance, could have starred in any number of horror movies.
Kath need rest and relaxation. Jumping between countries can be exhausting.
Oh, you can always say no. I teased. He enjoyed seeing Tiang and freaking out Shishi's court. I pulled an air shield around me to make sure everything, except gases, were pushed away from me. It was a neat trick they taught you in the high-level science labs. I frowned as the offering air required was almost twice what I would have normally expected, but the lure of discovering what clues might be inside distracted me.
Why would I want to stay here? I did mention I've been bored, he asked as he prowled around the outside of the house. If you did more exciting things, I would be here more often.
He exaggerated how often he left. Most of the time, it was while I slept, as it worked out well with the time zones. I'm sorry there are not enough life and death chases for you, I said with a laugh as I stepped in. While I couldn't smell anything via my shield, the house hadn't been well kept up even before he died, and now, From the bugs and scurrying things with tails I saw, it wasn't going to get much better. I can ask Hamadia to dump you into some of the more interesting realms when you sleep. Caroline ignored that comment. No one was stupid enough to enrage Hamadia. Seeing what she could do when she liked you raised nightmares, in my mind at least, of what was possible if she hated you. The house was a one-bedroom place with a small bathroom, a kitchen, living area, and that was it. Definitely not a laboratory. There hadn't been a basement or even a root cellar. I walked around, not touching anything, just taking in what information I could. I knew that forensics had been through here, but per the report, they hadn't found anything of interest. "Where did you go to get sick?" I murmured as I turned slowly in a circle. There was a pile of mail on the desk, and I looked out the window. No mailbox. Walking over, I saw all of it was to a P.O. box. Curious, I put a piece of obvious junk mail in my pocket after running the tiniest bit of static electricity over it and frowning again as it took almost a full 2 inches from 3 strands of hair. That confused me, but I finished my perusal around, then walked out. Caroline met me on the steps into the house. I rubbed his ears. "You find anything odd?" He leaned into the caress, tilting his head so I would get his chin.
No.
I snickered and scratched his brow between his eyes. I might have an idea. Come on. I didn't say anything more until I reached the car, and sure enough, 2 of the 3 other victims had P.O. boxes. Let's go to the post office.
I'm going to nap. There is nothing to chase or hunt.
He curled up in the back seat, and I let him be, though I drove extra carefully, both because I didn't want him hurt, but also the idea of all that weight and claws coming flying at me in a panic did not sound fun. I pulled up to the post office and looked around. It was small, a bit dingy, but serviceable. I walked in and convinced someone by dint of using my ID card and the sheriff's name to show me where the boxes for the 3 people were. They weren't next to each other or anything, but in a post office this small, I didn't really think it mattered. Outside the post office, the scenery stayed the same. Rolling land, buildings, cows. I stopped. Cows. I pulled up the Department of Agriculture website and called. As I waited, I leaned against the car and stared at the cows and the smallish barn in the distance. It took me 20 minutes to get the right person on the phone who pulled up records for the area.
There are no reported cases of any diseases in animals in the state of Nebraska.
Even over the phone, I could hear the official capitalization.
However, for normally treated diseases, you will need to check with the local veterinarians to see if there have been any outbreaks that needed to be dealt with. Only large outbreaks are reported, though any farm selling to consumers has to have a certificate of health on file with us. Are there any more questions?
The person sounded exasperated and annoyed. I didn't care. One more. Which diseases are required to be reported immediately? From the sigh on the other end, you would have thought I was asking a teenager to clean their room.
The NLRAD, National List of Reportable Animal Diseases, is available on the website.
They rattled it off, and I noted it, only because www.aphis.usda.gov was relatively easy to remember. That's it. Thanks. I disconnected and tracked where I could drive up to the barn in the distance. I could do it today, but I needed to file a report, review the diseases, let the sheriff know what little I'd found, and I was starving. Where do you want to go hunting at? I asked Caroline as I started to drive back to the house. And remember, you only have a license for a deer. No bringing down an elk or bison. I'm not wasting that much meat. No matter how much he wanted to eat, 10 pounds of meat tended to fill him up, and then he'd not eat for 2 to 3 days. When he ate daily, it was about double a serving of what I'd eat and be happy. Mostly meat, though he had a soft spot for the weirdest foods. Pasta and hot sauce topped the list.
You are cruel. Think how delicious an elk would taste.
I was driving, so I couldn't turn around to stare at him. Have you ever seen me dress or butcher an animal? Do you think I have any idea how to? Do you think I want to know how to? If you get a deer, I expect you to take it to share with your mother or even your siblings. He didn't deign to answer me, but I figured my point was made. Normally when he hunted with me, he might catch something small, but he couldn't eat a whole deer. My familiar was being arrogant and wasteful. 10 minutes later, we were driving up the road to my rental house, while I was still thinking about the idea of a farm being the epicenter. I waited until I had made some food. I really needed to quit skipping meals. I sat out on the deck while Caroline was busy terrorizing the wildlife. Once I'd eaten enough to take the edge off my hunger, I called the sheriff.
Yes, Merlin Monroe,
he said after I identified myself. Sheriff Talliance, I believe you wanted to be kept up to date with what I found. I heard him shift as he replied.
Yes.
He didn't say anything else, and I sighed. I didn't find much. I have more research to do, but I had a question about the small farm, a bit run down, near the post office.
The Jensens, old place. Son Billy Jensen stayed to take care of it, but isn't making any money. Meat isn't high enough quality, and he has too many issues with the locals for them to be willing to help.
His answer was fast, but the tone didn't tell me anything. Issues?
Mother died when he was a freshman in high school. She was a magician, did her service, and married someone with no magic. Still not sure why she died. The autopsy didn't show anything. Billy started having problems in high school. At first little things, truancy, fighting. Then it escalated to shoplifting and drugs. Nothing bad enough to get more than a slap on the wrist. But enough that he doesn't have many friends. His dad wasn't the friendliest either. They might live here, but few would regard them as members of the community.
Mages? I put another bite of chicken a la king in my mouth and chewed as I listened.
No, or at least not tattooed. If either emerged, they didn't reach past hedge or they didn't get tested.
The way he said that made me wonder how common it was. I knew anyone who was AIN didn't have to be tested. It had to do with the treaty they signed back in the late 1800s. But there was some level of control, wasn't there? And how did an AIN get to be sheriff? More questions I'd probably never get the answers to. Good to know. Any issue with me visiting out there tomorrow?
Bring the cath. It should keep them polite.
The fact that he named Caroline as a cath surprised me. Most people assumed I had said cat, and I hadn't told him what Caroline was, had I? Will do. Any other advice?
Don't get killed. I dislike the paperwork.
He hung up, and I laughed. Alexin and he seemed to be cut from the same mold. I got up to grab my laptop and a water, then went back to the deck, listening to the quiet as I pulled up the USDA website. There were some pox variations on the list, but interestingly, not cowpox. The list wasn't as large as I had somehow expected, yet more comprehensive at the same time. So many diseases, and I had no idea how many could kill people. Some? Most? Epidemiology had never excited me too much, so anything I learned was outside the basics. Nothing jumped out at me as to what might be causing this. I filed a report for Naomi and copied Stephen. It didn't say much besides that I had arrived, met with local authorities, and had a few things to check out. Then I closed my laptop and stared out at the landscape. It was so different from Georgia or Upper New York. My hand drifted down to the life in my stomach. The idea still amazed me. The idea that I could carry another life inside me. How did women do this?
Cori?
Caroline's voice filtered in, and I looked up, searching for him. Nothing looked like him on the grassy plain, and I thought, I might be able to see his red coat if nothing else. Yes?
I think you should come see this.
He sounded odd, not glutted from a hunt or sated, just odd. Where is here? I asked, standing up and looking around. He sent an image of where he was standing, and I went to sidestep and shuddered as magic fought me. I stumbled, coming out of the step. The price 2 inches of hair. Why, by Merlin? I gasped, shuddering. I'd been sidestepping for so long I barely even thought about it anymore. This startled me. Cori? Before the word faded from my mind, Caroline was pressed up next to me.
What happened?
I don't know. I placed my hand over my stomach. Not that I could sense anything. I knew I could sense magic being used if I tried, but I still just felt like me. It was like I had to fight to come here, and the offering was high, way high.
That might be because of this.
He turned and pointed to something a few yards away from us. I turned and stared. There were plants growing in a riotous manner around a gap in the trees. None of them looked like anything I'd seen before in the United States. The colors of the plants might have looked at home in a jungle, but not in a small grove of trees. But that wasn't what really caught my attention. I was riveted on the small rip that hung there. When Indira had been teaching me, she opened small rips about 1 inch or 2 long, and I would close them. I knew there were detectors for rips, but I'd never thought about how big they had to be for detection to register. Lips pursed, I pulled out my phone. Luckily, it had been in my pocket, and texted Indira. How big does a rip have to be for the detectors to catch it? I stared at the phone, willing her to respond. The typing buttons appeared, much to my relief. At least 2 feet in diameter. 3 is always caught. Why? I hadn't realized they could get that big without detection. Found one, was curious about why it hadn't been closed. She sent me a shrugging emoji. It happens. Close it and let the OMO know. Those tend to be small enough that not much can slip through, so no one worries about them. We just deal with them when they are found. Be careful, though. Even small things can be dangerous. Got it. Thanks. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, and with a bit more trepidation than I would have had 10 minutes ago, I reached out with my magic to close the rip. It resisted, which I expected, but I closed it. Again, it required a much larger offering than I had ever experienced before. Should I destroy those plants? I asked, not moving any closer. They looked like they could have been extras in a horror movie.
Probably. Chaos things are a bit too aggressive for Earth.
I reached for fire, Joe's magic. We never let slip that since the joining, I could use her and Sable's branches at the same level they could. There was enough heat in the area and in the ground around me. I didn't need to cheat with a lighter. Maybe I should have. To my surprise, fire spouted, coming to me only after I offered 10 times what I had offered when I was null in that branch in college. But at that offering, it kept up around the plants and inhaled them, giggling away as it devoured all of them. What in the world is wrong with my magic? I burst out, confused and more than a bit worried. Was it fading away? Caroline gave me a sidelong glance, his tail lashing.
I do not know, but I am not happy about my queen having problems with her magic.
Chapter 15. Our favorite mage is in the news today. Stephen Alexant was seen with his longtime lover Indira Humbert leaving a 5-star restaurant tonight. Will they ever marry? Rumor is more than one eligible Merlin would be ready to snatch her up. Daily Magic News. Given the weirdness of my magic, I decided to walk back to the house. It was only a mile, and the exercise did me good. We did get a few double takes as we walked the last bit up the road to the driveway for the house, but mostly it gave me time to think and enjoy the different scenery. None of this made sense. The real world didn't have mad scientists, did it? Something Stephen Alexant had said to me years ago popped back into my mind. He had pointed out the government didn't allow stories of rogue mages to remain active news very long. No one wanted people scared of what mages could do. If I accepted that as fact, and I had seen it happen more than once, then were there people from a bad thriller lurking in the corners? I'd seen killers, abusers, drug traffickers, and worse. Why couldn't there be people who were mad scientists? The knowledge that I was bringing a kid into a world that seemed to get a bit darker every day made me shudder. I fell asleep that night with my hand over my stomach and promising I'd do everything to make this world a better place. My phone woke me before 6 a.m. "Hey, Naomi," I said through a yawn as I staggered into the unfamiliar kitchen. I missed knowing where everything was. "You're sleeping late," she said with a slightly arched tone. "It's only 6 here. I was enjoying the extra sleep." I started the coffee. "Oh, well, you're up now. Find anything?" She sounded way too awake. I glared at my phone, only half awake. "I filed a report yesterday. I've only been here a day and a half. Not really. Though I have a few things I need to check out." "When do you expect to be back?" She sounded exasperated, and I wanted to throw something at her. When did I get clairvoyant abilities? I don't have a clue. I have no idea if there is an issue here or what it might be. So I'll be back when I wrap it up here. I snapped that out a bit less politely than maybe I should have, but I was cranky. She sighed. "You can't blame me for wanting the double Merlin to have solved all the problems in half the time of any other agent. Anything I should be worried about?" I yawned my way through my answer. "Not really. Found a rip, closed it, but that isn't your department, more an Omo matter." "Yes, I'm not interested in managing magical issues. Having mages is bad enough." I snorted and poured some coffee. "Please, you like our abilities." "Yes, but the ego gets annoying." Her voice was acerbic, and I laughed. "Are you implying I have an ego?" I sipped the coffee, smiling as the bitter heat cut through my exhaustion. "Actually, no. You might have a cat with one, but you don't. It's refreshing. Just be warned, I think I'm going to have an investigation coming up with some aspects that will be right up your alley." "And that would be?" "Human traffickers and drug mules. We think they are using magic to transform the outside of the drugs so they aren't easily detected. Granted, it's lowering the overdose counts, but it's making it much more difficult to stop." I nodded as I looked out the window. "I can see that. Okay, I'll try to see if there's anything I can do and wrap it up in a few days." "See you then." She hung up, and I headed to the shower. I wanted to hit that farm first thing this morning. If you had animals, you were up early to feed them. At least that was the impression Caroline gave me. 30 minutes later, with Caroline complaining the entire time about having to get up and get moving without morning treats, we were on our way. Driving through farmland and seeing houses in the distance was almost relaxing, and nothing like driving in Atlanta or Albany. To be honest, if driving was like this all the time, I'd probably own a car. I took the road to the dairy farm, then the long driveway up to the house. I got out, and Caroline didn't bother to wait, leaping out the car window. "You could have opened the door," I pointed out.
Where would the fun be in that?
I shook my head. The calf was a menace that I dearly loved. I knew without a shadow of a doubt our child would be the most protected kid in the world. Part of me couldn't wait to see Caroline around a human baby. I suspected that I could create an entire video channel off of his cuteness. I'd have to shoot that idea to Sable. She'd love it. Up close, the farm seemed even more run down than it had yesterday from the post office. The cows were in the field, and they looked mostly healthy, but then they could have been on the verge of death. I might not have realized it. "Caroline, can you tell if they are healthy?" I figured the hunter would have a better idea than I would. I preferred my meat from the grocery store. He stood, looking at the wandering bovines, and flicked his tail.
I would eat them.
I took that at face value. He'd eaten things before that I wouldn't touch if you paid me. Our taste buds and what was deemed edible differed greatly. I looked around, but I had no knowledge of what would seem right or wrong on a farm. I tried to think about the paint on my parents' house, but they'd had siding, so maybe flaking paint was normal? The number of things I didn't know annoyed me. The barn was off to one side, while a small house was to my right. Being polite rarely hurt. I headed towards the house, looking around as I went. It all looked normal, if a bit run down. But then, most people didn't have a living house that made sure she and the grounds always looked perfect. I knocked on the door and stood there, listening carefully. Other than the echo of my knocks, I heard nothing. There was a standalone garage, but the door was down. The barn, the pastures, and an abandoned chicken coop, and another open building that had a tractor and a lawnmower parked in it. I didn't see anything else. I shrugged and headed to the barn. It was similar to a lot of others in the area. 2 stories, wings on either side, and a small silo attached to the back. It wasn't red, but white and gray, with an opening on the side I'd driven up on that I believed was for hay. Though my knowledge was mostly from the westerns I'd watched as a kid, so very likely to be wrong. Mostly it looked big, messy, and smelled like cow. Or cow manure, to be more exact. I headed to the smaller door on the side of the barn, not the huge double doors to the main part of the building. I wasn't sneaking exactly, but I didn't have a warrant or a valid reason to be here other than curiosity and a nagging feeling. That feeling sharpened as I pushed open the door. "There's a rip around here, somewhere," I said to Caroline, my voice swallowed by the barn. He lifted his head, looking around, but if he saw anything besides the feeding and milking stations, stacks of feed, and other equipment, I had no idea. Down at the end, there were a few big rooms with doors. Maybe someone was in there? The only experience I had with dairy farms was seeing them on the occasional show, and they weren't things I'd paid a lot of attention to. If there was anything off in this place, I'd never know. If there was, part of me really hoped it had neon letters over it saying, "Bad stuff here." It never worked like that. I headed towards the doors, glancing at the cleanish stations. The milking apparatus had me imagining it attached to my breasts. Ugh, hopefully the ones for babies weren't as creepy as that. I'll have to pump. That idea had me stumbling to a halt as my mind spiraled out of control. What had I gotten myself into? Women worldwide do this daily. You can handle it. I repeated the mantra in my head over and over again. This wasn't worth freaking out about. I could pump milk. Women did it all the time. I fought to swallow and dragged my mind back to the job. People getting sick. Odd viruses, and something that was twanging off my senses. Where was that rip? I moved toward the doors, listening for anyone, though Caroline would hear it well before I did. The first room I entered was a parts room, with a small desk in it, mostly covered with paper. I just shut the door and moved to the next one. A quick peek let me know it was a bathroom, and I didn't bother going any further. Toilets were mostly the same everywhere. The last door opened smoothly, without a hint of resistance. Fear, and the feeling of a rip ate at my hindbrain. I peered into a room with tables against 2 of the walls, and equipment that would have looked right at home in our lab. Except that where ours was pristine, clean, everything carefully put away and wiped down, this place looked like a dorm room for jocks. There was a refrigerator against the other wall and what looked like a small wine fridge, and in the far corner, above the tables, was a rip. It wasn't very big, only about 1 foot long and 6 inches wide. But even through that small little gap, I could see things moving that made me jerk my eyes away. Chaos?
Yes.
Caroline confirmed. He sounded as worried as I felt. I pulled up my air shield. Do you want me to shield you? He paused, looking around.
Let me go to the other side. I want to see what area of chaos this is.
His tail twitched as he looked around.
Be careful.
His tail stroked the back of my hand. Then he pulled open a rip and stepped through. It closed, unlike the one hanging in the air in the corner. I could close it, but I'd wait to see what Caroline found there. He could walk in the realms without an issue. I wasn't about to step over without someone else maintaining the pocket realm I was stepping into. The realms could be dangerous, even if you were a double Merlin, and I really preferred not to be in situations where I needed to rapidly grab magic. I did better if I could plan out my actions. The offering for the air shield had been really high, and I frowned. Never before had I needed to worry about the amount magic would cost. But a half-inch of hair for a shield? That didn't make sense. I triple-checked that it only let in air molecules, something I'd trained myself to visualize exactly, then moved into the room. It was significantly cooler than it had been outside, and I looked around again, finally spotting a small portable AC that vented to the outside. The ramifications of that made me shudder. If it was venting air and anything was loose in here, then that might explain the contamination. But I was jumping to conclusions. For all I knew, this was a common setup in dairy farms, though I doubted that. I worked my way around the room, looking at, but not touching, the equipment. Microscopes, a small tablet computer, and lots of petri dishes and lab slides that seemed to be everywhere. I glared at the tablet, but it didn't turn on, and without a hazmat suit, which was still in my car trunk, I wasn't touching anything. The knowledge that I should go get the suit popped up in my brain, but I didn't want to take the time. I wanted to verify there were deadly viruses here, get out, and call in the authorities. While I might be one of them, I definitely wasn't the right authority for this job. I could call for a full hazmat team, but if they got out here and it turned out all of this was just for validating milk quality or something, I'd look like an absolute idiot. Even though I'd been working for Naomi for almost 2 years at this point, I was still the most junior person, and I made some bad mistakes. For all the awesome I did, there was also the stupid. I stood in the middle of the small lab and wrestled with myself. Just a quick look around, verify that there are viruses here, then get out and call the cavalry. My voice sounded muffled in the air shield. The petri dishes all looked the same, gunk in them, but nothing that meant anything to me. I kept moving around to look at everything, but without peering in microscopes, I couldn't tell anything. I crept around the corner with the rip. The need to close it clawed at me, but I waited. If this was as bad as I thought, I needed to leave it there as evidence. The AC wasn't on at the moment, so I kept walking around, looking for papers or something else I could glean information from. But regardless of the mess, there wasn't much lying around I could snoop through. The refrigerator sat there, mocking me. I spun slowly and my eyes landed on a box of gloves. Grinning, I stepped over and carefully sealed the air around my wrist as I pulled on 2 gloves. Air whispered and complained, and I had to offer yet another 1/4 inch of hair to my concern. But right then, I pushed that worry to the side, wanting to focus on the refrigerator. The gloves finally settled onto my hands, and I carefully cracked open the fridge. Nothing jumped out at me as being weird or out of the usual, but maybe I shouldn't go by my experience. For me, a fridge full of beakers and petri dishes was relatively normal. Opening the fridge was pushing it, but if I started moving things around, it would be crossing lines. With a sigh, I closed the door. There was no freezer. That left only the wine fridge to look in. I crouched to open it and peer in. I blinked and had to look again. There, neatly labeled, was rack after rack of vials. I had to peer closely, the light not being the best, but I recognized the names as those of different viruses. Anthrax, variola minor smallpox, even varicella chickenpox. Merlin's balls. How did these get here? I rose slowly. It didn't really matter. What did matter was they needed to be contained and dealt with, and that wasn't anything I could do. Well, I could, but setting the entire place on fire probably wasn't the best idea.
Who are you? Why are you here? This is my place!
The voice came from right behind me.